For a very short period of my life, I want to say it was around the time I was the age of 15 or 16, I lived in a fairly small house in Vermont. My family didn't live there long. It was located in the forest and far from almost everything, making any task that required leaving the house pretty inconvenient. However, there's one experience I had at that house in the time I lived there that I'll likely never forget. It happened in January. I only remember that because I can recall New Year's Day being just a few days earlier. My cousin Jason and I were both still on school break at the time and had planned to spend the night at my place. This was something we would often do. We would typically stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. playing Xbox, watching movies, or something along those lines. This would all happen in the living room. This night, we had been watching a movie. I don't remember what movie it was, but that's not important. What I do remember is being maybe halfway through the movie when Jason kept looking out the window, just slightly to the right of where we were sitting. It got to the point where, like every minute, I could see his head move out of the corner of my eye. Now, I should mention, on that night there was a fairly bad snowstorm happening. At first, I just thought he had been watching the snowfall, until I realized just how long he had been staring out the window for. I asked him what he was looking at. He kept staring, and responded saying how he thought he saw something. This instantly filled me with anxiety. I think this was mostly due to where we lived. Wild animals weren't all that common, and like I mentioned earlier, we didn't really live near anything. So someone on our property, especially at this hour and during a snowstorm, would 100% be cause for concern. Nothing happened for a couple minutes. I kept asking follow-up questions, but he just told me to be quiet, like as if to be able to focus. That's when we saw it. The clear shadow of a person sprinting from one tree to the next. Both of us physically jumped in reaction. There was no sound, but the sheer sight alone was enough to startle us. Now, this was a good 200 feet out from the house, so we couldn't exactly tell if the person was coming closer or not. We both looked at each other and right back out the window, I guess as a way to confirm what we just saw. A couple minutes of this went by, when it happened again, but this time much further to the left of where the first sighting had occurred. Slowly over time, the sightings would become more frequent. It was clear by this point that there was more than just one person. Eventually, one of the figures got out from behind a tree, but this time, instead of moving behind another one, it just stood there. And after a couple seconds, the figure started sprinting in our direction. This was enough to break us out of our sort of trance of disbelief we were in and run. I ran straight upstairs to wake up my dad, but by the time he got up and followed me downstairs, there was no one visible outside. Jason and I both explained to him what we had seen. Typically, I don't think my dad would have believed us, but I guess he was able to see the genuine panic in our eyes. We all went around the house, verifying all the doors and windows were locked. My dad then went outside armed with a weapon. He briefly walked around the house before returning inside, but he found nothing. That night, we convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us. Come morning, and the snowstorm had almost completely stopped. We went outside to better assess the situation in the daylight, and we would find multiple sets of footprints in the snow next to the trees facing our living room's window. They were pretty filled in from the snowstorm, but still clearly visible and recognizable as footprints. There were even some around the house, like on top of the footprints my dad had made the night before. I even talked to my dad about it, and he said those had not been there when he went outside. Even more disturbing was how our shed had been left completely open, with the only things stolen being our knives we used for hunting. None of this, however, would be enough to get my dad to call the cops. He always had this we take care of our own mentality, and I guess he just never saw calling 911 as an option. We moved out of that house 2 weeks later. Not because of the incident, rather that just so happened to be when we had planned to move. I was extremely grateful for this. At least as far as I know, nothing happened in those 2 weeks. This whole experience still freaks me out to this day. Seeing firsthand multiple people on your isolated property in the middle of the night and during a snowstorm is straight out of a nightmare, and I do my best not to think about it. This all happened during the winter months of 2014. Around that time, my dad got a new job that required us to move. Not a small move. It was a good 9 hours away from the house I grew up in. We hired a moving truck, but we still had the task of getting our car down to the new house. This time of year also happened to be around the time I was learning to drive. I guess my dad thought 9 hours on the highway would be good practice for me. So the plan was me and my dad would drive the car down to the new house, while my mom and my sisters would fly. I wasn't exactly looking forward to the drive. Not because of the time, I didn't really mind that part. I was more so worried about the blizzard my phone was showing we would hit halfway into our trip. Driving in the snow as a new driver is not something I really ever wanted to experience. My dad dismissed this though, telling me it wasn't that bad, and for the most part would just feel the same as normal driving. Anyway, we left at around 3 p.m., so we were sent to get to the new house at around midnight. Come around 8 p.m., and yeah, we got hit by the blizzard. It was a lot more extreme than I'd imagined it would be. Although, my dad must have trusted my inexperienced driving for whatever reason, as he never once said anything about him wanting to take over the wheel. So, I kept going. Eventually, my nightmare would come true. I lost control of the car, and we were sent sliding off the road in towards a line of trees. In the moment, I tried my best to avoid them, but the car slightly grazed one of them. Luckily, I don't think my dad was that mad. It's not like we hit a tree head-on at full speed. We got out to assess the damage, and by some miracle, there was nothing but a slight scratch on the back passenger side door. I held back a laugh of genuine relief. Just then, I noticed a vehicle coming up the road with some extremely bright high beams on. As it got closer, it started honking, and continued doing so until it pulled up right next to us. The guy rolled down his window. I figured he was going to ask us if we needed help. But no, he looked at us and began some awkward small talk, completely ignoring the situation we were currently in. My dad just kind of looked at the dude and told him we didn't have time to talk and asked what he needed. The guy responded with something like, I just noticed you dropped something about a mile back. I think it fell into your trunk. Now, we did have a few things in our trunk that we didn't send with the moving truck, but there was no way any of it could have fallen out, or at least I thought. I looked at my dad and asked him if there was any way something could have fallen out. My dad started his response, but was interrupted by the man saying, "Well, you must have, because I was right behind you. It's in my back seat here. Why don't you go ahead and get it so I can get out of here?" I figured it couldn't hurt to look, just in case we actually had dropped something somehow. But right as I put my hand on the guy's backseat door handle, my dad abruptly yelled at me, saying that we didn't lose anything, and to get back in our car immediately. A few seconds of silence, with my hand still on the door handle, went by. Yelling was completely out of character for my dad, though I eventually listened to him and got back in our car. We drove off, with not another word being said by either us or the guy. I couldn't help but notice the extremely disturbing and almost angry face of the driver as we drove past him. Once we got a few miles down the road, my dad would apologize for yelling at me. I of course told him it was fine, just that I wasn't really expecting it. I will never forget what he said next. He said he felt like he had to, because while I was heading towards the guy's back door, through the window he could just barely make out the silhouettes of two men waiting on the other side. He would further explain that by the looks of their movements as I was walking towards the door, upon opening the door, I would either be attacked, kidnapped, or worse. Hearing this was a complete shock to me, but to this day, I'm still glad my dad told me what he saw. It taught me at a young age that not everyone has the best intentions in this world. However, at the end of the day, we can't 100% confirm the guy had bad intentions. But I myself truly believe my dad's instincts were correct. The whole situation just didn't add up. Why would there have been two men waiting right at the door for me to open it? And on top of that, when we got to our new house, we were able to verify that nothing was missing from our trunk. Thinking about this whole experience still scares me, even today. This happened when I was 18. I had just finished up my first semester of college, and a couple friends I had met there planned to rent out a cabin on some lake over the weekend through Airbnb. They asked if I wanted to go, and I said yeah. I didn't really know much about the destination, but I decided I'd go regardless. I was done with finals, and honestly felt like I could just use some solid time away from it all. So my two friends and I, who I'll just call Brad and Dustin, were set to leave. The cabin was about an hour away. When we arrived, we unpacked the stuff we brought for the weekend and got settled inside. The first night was honestly kinda creepy, at least for me, because the cabin was pretty remote. It was the only one on the lake, and as far as I'm concerned, it was the only one within miles of nothing but forest. I'm someone who's used to being in cities with lots of people, not quiet forests with the occasional howl of coyotes. Needless to say, it was for sure a scene I would have to get used to. But all things considered, the first night was completely fine. It was the second night where things took a turn. All throughout the second day, a blizzard took place outside. We didn't really plan for it. I guess none of us thought to check the weather before making the trip. I mean, you gotta remember, all three of us were only 18 at the time, so not the brightest. Anyway, on the second night, Brad and I slept in our own bedrooms upstairs, while Dustin slept on a couch downstairs. I think it was around 2 AM when Dustin went upstairs and woke both of us up, saying how the outside motion light kept turning on and off again. Brad told him it was most likely just an animal activating it, or the light simply being activated by the motion of the falling snow. But what Dustin responded with was pretty terrifying. He explained how that's what he thought too, but after looking outside, he saw what he described as something resembling the shadow of a person at around 6 foot tall. This definitely freaked us out a bit, but Brad, who was still convinced it had to be an animal, said he would go downstairs to check it out. And so that's what he did. Meanwhile, Dustin and I stayed upstairs. A good 3 minutes went by, when a blood-curdling scream rang out downstairs. Dustin and I ran downstairs as fast as we could. Brad was lying on the floor and pointing at the living room window. We looked out the window, but there was nothing. He practically screamed at us to go upstairs, and so the three of us did. The rooms in the cabin didn't have locks, so we resorted to barricading ourselves in one of the bedrooms. Brad quietly explained to us that when he got downstairs, he started by looking out all the kitchen windows, and when he didn't see anything, he made his way to the living room window. He pulled back the curtain, and at first saw nothing, but not nothing like an empty snowy forest. He literally saw pure black darkness. Confused, he cupped his hands to his eyes and got closer to the window. But that's when he realized it was a person blocking the view. He then screamed and fell back. Now, at this point, I hadn't seen anything myself. Don't get me wrong, I was still horrified. But in the back of my mind, I still wasn't ruling out the fact that they might have just been imagining things. Just then, the power cut out. It felt like my heart had completely stopped for at least 5 seconds. I was now hysterical at this point. All doubt I had in the sightings Brad and Dustin experienced instantly vanished. I genuinely felt like my life was over in that moment. We had no weapons, and worse yet, no phone service. All we could do was sit and wait until daylight. Fortunately, nothing further would occur in that time. Once the sun was up, we took down the barricade and all started getting our stuff. We had no intentions of staying there any longer than we needed to. It was still snowing, but luckily the vehicle we brought was good in the snow. Before we left, we took a quick survey of the outside area around the cabin. There were no footprints, but this was likely because they were filled in by the snow. This had to have been the case, as there were no footprints by the fuse box outside, yet it was completely destroyed. It looked like it was smashed in multiple times by an axe. The sight of this was enough to get us to leave immediately. Later we tried contacting the Airbnb owner, but we got no response. I always thought this was weird. I mean, if your fuse box got completely destroyed, I'd imagine you'd want to talk to the people renting the cabin at the time. But no, not even a text back from the guy. I stayed friends with Brad and Dustin throughout the rest of college. We would talk about the experience from time to time, but for the most part we kept it to ourselves. We still don't know who was stalking us in the woods that night, or what their intentions were. This happened about 2 years ago. I was out for a long walk in the woods, an activity I frequently do, especially in the summertime. On this day, I had set out early. The route I typically take is in a large woodland with many different paths that take you deeper and deeper in. This time specifically, I decided to make a bit of a change to my usual routine. I decided to walk down a bank in order to walk alongside a river. You could catch glimpses of it if you were higher up on the path, but for the most part, you could really only hear it. It was also much more remote when compared to the other paths. I had been out for 3 hours at this point. I had a book, food and drink, and a first aid kit in my bag. I had walked far and kept walking, exploring the area. However, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, but it was intense. I'm usually one for the quiet outdoors and nature, but this feeling I had kept making me look behind me, to the point where I was no longer relaxed. As I got deeper into the woods, the loneliness became unnerving. I figured I was just scaring myself and tried not to play into it. That's when a cloaked figure with gloves on ran out in front of me. I instantly jumped and felt extremely alarmed. The figure had a mask on, a crow's mask, think a plague doctor mask. I wanted to run, and everything inside me was telling me to run, but for whatever reason, I really wanted to seem like I wasn't bothered, and that the figure had failed to cause much of a reaction. So I awkwardly said,
Okay, good one. I'll be on my way now.
The figure didn't say anything. Rather, it began tilting its head as I walked around it and continued down the path. It was just standing there, watching me. I was extremely creeped out. Once I walked past it, I just kept walking, feeling shaken, but trying not to let it show. I was nervous to look back, but eventually I did. The creepy figure was stood in the same place, still watching me walk away. He, or possibly she, gave me a wave, but not a friendly one, just a sinister one. I don't really know how to explain it, but it was slow and felt threatening. I was stupid at this point. I felt far enough away from the figure, so I flipped at the bird, a choice I instantly regretted. The figure went from standing and waving to a full-on unhinged run in my direction. I, at this point, didn't stick around and legged it out of there. The figure was making intense, loud, and almost demonic noises as it chased me. I honestly thought I was going to die. But it all came to an end when I managed to outrun this freak and made it up onto an open footpath where I was reunited with joggers and dog walkers. I was stuck in this nervous state, but still so beyond happy to see other people. I tried to make as many of them aware as I could, and the whole situation was ultimately reported. I got home safely by catching a bus into town. They were rare on that side of the county, but I managed, thankfully. I felt lucky, yet really detached and uncomfortable. The area was investigated by police, but it was so deep in the woods, I don't know how much they covered. As of yet, nothing has been reported since, and nobody nor anything has been found. I now avoid that area, and don't plan on going too far off the beaten track on my own again. I still think about this experience. It's still vivid in my mind, and absolutely terrifying to me. This happened years ago, when I was 21. Back then, I was good friends with a guy named Jack, who I met in high school. Both of us grew up with a passion for the outdoors, and so we thought it'd be fun to go on a week-long backpacking trip in the California woods together. We'd done this once before, and I really enjoyed it. I remember looking forward to it. The whole trip started off going well, but that only lasted till the second night. It was just starting to get dark, and Jack and I were setting up our tents for the night, when we began to hear the distant sound of leaves crunching under multiple pairs of footsteps. We were pretty deep in the forest, but running into other campers wasn't completely unheard of, just, I guess, a bit of a rare occurrence. Eventually, 3 guys came into view. They didn't really look like campers. They didn't even have backpacks or anything. I thought it was kind of weird to be wandering around the forest this late, but I didn't think much of it. They gave us a somewhat friendly greeting, and we gave one back. They then asked us if we were camping here tonight, which, obviously, we were in the process of setting up our tents and had the rest of our stuff all laid out. We politely said yeah, and asked if that was a problem. We wanted to make sure we weren't on someone's private property, or, just generally in a place we're not supposed to be. They replied saying no, and just kind of walked off. The whole encounter was odd, but Jack didn't think so. He pointed out how they were most likely just hunters in the area, as all of them were armed, something I myself didn't notice. Cut to a few hours later, and Jack and I were now asleep in our respective tents. This was around the time I woke up to the sound of yelling, like multiple voices shouting in the distance. I yelled out to Jack to see if he was awake. He was, and was just as confused as I was. It was 2 a.m. when this happened. Our conversation was then interrupted by multiple gunshots. They honestly sounded like they were getting closer. I asked Jack if he thought that whoever these people were just hunting. He responded saying,
"No, dude, there's no way they're hunting this late. I think we should go."
My heart started to race, now realizing the reality of the situation we were in. We both unzipped our tents, grabbed only our bare necessities, and started hastily moving west. We moved for maybe half an hour before stopping. The yelling and gunshots were now barely audible, although they were persistent, continuing off and on up until sunrise. All night, we basically just sat there listening to them, both wide awake from a mixture of fear and adrenaline. When the sun finally rose, we discussed what to do next. Ultimately, we decided we would wait until noon before heading back to our campsite. The plan was to then quickly pack up all of our stuff and make the trek back to our cars, cutting our trip 5 days short. Fast forward to noon, and we started consciously heading back. When we arrived, the sight we were met with was nothing short of horrifying. Our campsite had been completely ransacked. Almost all of our stuff had been damaged, which this is thousands of dollars in equipment we're talking about. But most disturbing were the bullet holes shot into our tents. You don't have to be that smart to conclude that these people had genuinely tried to kill us. Further supporting this theory is the fact that nothing was actually stolen from our campsite. It was all just damaged. Though, as far as who did this, we don't know. The only people we can really pin as suspects are the 3 people that walked up to us as we were building our tents. But this begs the question, why? Why would they do this? The whole experience has left us with more questions than answers. Nothing about it makes much sense, but I know I myself just feel lucky to be alive. In the end, we ended up quickly salvaging all the equipment we could, and made the trek back to our cars. Nowadays, I don't camp nearly as much as I used to. I'm 25, and ever since I was young, I've been into hiking. Now, I get hiking isn't all that appealing to most people, but because of where I live, it's pretty easy to get into. You don't have to travel all that far for a pretty stunning scenic view. I try to find a new trail to hike every weekend. Typically, I'll hike alone, so I always keep a knife in my backpack for protection against the wildlife, should it ever come to that. Though, in all my years of hiking, I've never once had to actually use it. In fact, I've never run into any dangerous situation while hiking. Well, at least up until a few days ago. I was driving to a heavily forested hiking trail I'd never been to before. Now, I hike in the afternoon, and this happened around the time of year where the days were starting to get shorter. In other words, the sun was setting earlier and earlier each day. This was a key detail that I had completely forgotten about prior to leaving. Only after I started driving to the place did I realize it would be completely dark outside before I would even be able to finish my hike. A decision I still regret making is deciding to do the hike anyway. I got a bad feeling about it right when I started. Fast forward a few hours, and I was now about 85% finished with the route I picked out. By this point, it was almost completely dark. I had a flashlight, but still, the whole scene was pretty eerie. This portion of the trail was deep in the forest. It was so dense with trees that the moonlight could barely even find its way through. Don't get me wrong, beautiful scenery in the day, but alone at night, nothing short of disturbing. It was then when I was really starting to regret my decision of carrying out the hike. That's when I saw a light up ahead on the trail. As soon as I shined my flashlight in its direction, it immediately got turned off. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't exactly turn back, so I was pretty much forced to go directly towards where it had been. In the back of my mind, I knew the chances of it being another hiker in the dark were slim to none. Eventually, I reached where the light came from. There was no one. Instead, there was a large duffel bag lying on the ground. I began scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when a large, probably 6.5-foot man stepped out from behind one of the trees. My body completely froze up. There I stood like a deer in headlights, shining my light on the guy. He then slowly revealed a machete from behind his back. Seeing this, I started running for my life down the trail and in the direction of my car. I looked behind me and the guy was chasing me. I dropped my backpack so I could run faster. When I finally reached a clearing in the forest and could see my car, still sprinting, I grabbed my keys from my pocket and unlocked it. I got inside, locked the doors, and had the engine on in less than 5 seconds. However, the guy was still behind me and was able to completely slash one of my back tires before I could drive off. I drove on an almost completely flat tire for the next 5 miles back to my house. Right as I pulled into my driveway, I called the police and reported the man. Although, I have no idea if he was found. Quite frankly, I have no idea if the police even searched for him. A part of me wants to go back to retrieve my backpack, which contains hundreds of dollars in equipment, but there's no way I can bring myself to do it. Plus, there's no guarantee it's still even there. For all I know, the guy went back and took it. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that night. This was by far the scariest experience I've ever had, and the closest I've ever felt to death. This happened back in 2016, during that sort of killer clown phase. I don't know if you guys remember that, but if you were in the US during that time, there's a good chance you know what I'm talking about. Basically, in 2016, this sick trend where people would dress up as clowns and scare people became insanely popular. It had a lot of people scared, and rightfully so, as some scary stories came from the whole ordeal. But if I'm being honest, it never really bothered me, at least at the time. Now, I think it's important to note that I had just recently moved, and because of that, I started going to a new high school. Word must have got out about my Snapchat username, as I had a ton of new people from the school adding me. I had given my username to a few people, so I didn't think it was that weird. I simply added everyone back that added me. I checked, and most of them showed up on the snap map nearby to my high school, so it wasn't like I was adding back complete strangers. I remember it was Friday. I had just gotten back from school, and it was 8 p.m. The reason I'd stayed so late was because the school had volleyball tryouts that same night, and back then I was really into that sort of thing. I remember when I got home, I got something to eat when my cousin texted me, asking if she could come over. I of course said yeah, since after all it was a Friday, and around an hour later we were sitting in the living room watching Netflix. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, I jokingly told my cousin to look out the window just behind her. A little weird, I know, but we always used to mess with each other and try to scare the other person. Though, this time, when she looked over her shoulder, she didn't look back right away. She replied, saying she thought she actually saw someone. Not thinking anything of it, I just figured she was trying to scare me back, and pretty much forgot about it. That was until about an hour later, when out of nowhere my dog jumped up, ran to the front door, and started barking aggressively. My cousin and I both looked at each other. Something to be noted is my dog is insanely quiet, only barking when he feels threatened. It actually startled me, as I hadn't even heard him bark for months. I thought it might have been possible that he heard a noise from the TV or something, but the movie we were watching had ended like 30 minutes ago, and we were both just sitting in silence on our phones. Keep in mind, at this point it was around midnight. Finally, around 1 a.m. my cousin and I decided to go upstairs and start getting ready to go to sleep. I still remember this moment perfectly to this day. I was laying down, on my phone checking Snapchat, when I decided to open the snap map. And that's when I saw it. According to the map, 4 other people were at my location, as in close enough to where Snapchat groups your Bitmojis together. One of them was my cousin, but the other 3 were random Bitmojis I'd never seen before. I started thinking of all the possibilities of who would be this close to me. I went through all their profiles, but I didn't remember adding a single one of them. I knew I must have at some point without realizing it, as like I said, I had been adding a lot of new people recently. Now a little worried, I told my cousin, and we went downstairs to check and make sure all the doors were locked. Something that should be mentioned is it had been snowing for a better part of the day, and as we checked the doors, we couldn't help but notice fresh footprints signifying people had been walking around the property. There were even some in the backyard, which was gated, meaning whoever it was had to have jumped the fence. We were genuinely worried now. When I checked the snap map, it said the 3 guys' locations were last seen an hour ago. And an hour ago was when my dog started viciously barking at the front door for no reason. The more I thought about everything, the more it seemed to connect, but there was really nothing we could do, as we already searched the whole house and locked all the doors. My cousin and I were the only ones supposed to be home this night, and we didn't want to call the police as we didn't even know if we were in any true danger. That was when I remembered the house actually did have multiple cameras around the property, and I figured we could check those. The reason I only remembered just then was because, like I said, we had only just recently moved into the house, and our last house was pretty old, so we didn't have anything close to cameras. Anyway, we started looking through what the cameras had picked up within the last few hours. Now, when going through the footage, you could actually turn on a setting so that it would only show you the clips where motion was detected. So I selected it, and it started playing clip after clip from cameras that detected motion. Almost all of them just featured tree branches blowing in front of the camera, or normal stuff like that. But eventually, we were shown a clip of some random people we'd never seen before walk up on our property. They were all dressed head to toe in clown costumes, each carrying a baseball bat in their hands. More clips were shown of the clowns walking around. More times than once, you could see as they cupped their hands against the windows in an attempt to look inside. My cousin and I were both absolutely terrified at this point, and we instantly called the cops. Though we didn't think it'd do much good, as all the clips were about an hour old. When they finally arrived, they asked us a few questions and looked around the property, verifying that nobody was still lurking around. Of course, at that point they didn't find anyone, and just told us they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. We would end up making a report on the clowns for trespassing, and gave the cops as much information as we could, including some of the footage, and even the Snapchat usernames of the profiles that were on our location. I would of course block all the accounts, but made sure to get a ton of screenshots before doing so. I still don't know who those people were, or how they were able to get my Snapchat. This whole ordeal has been very stressful and scary for me, my cousin, and the rest of our family. I'm still shaken up by the thought that they could return at any point with worse intentions. A couple years ago, when I was 15, I was really big into Snapchat. I was kind of obsessed with building my Snap score, so I would add random friends and accept random requests to do so. It was pretty weird, I know, but being that young, my Snap score was a number that mattered to me for whatever reason. Now, a lot of my friends from school and I have this group chat. I remember it was a Saturday when one of them mentioned we should go to the mall. A lot of them agreed, and I wanted to as well, but realized I didn't have a ride. So I posted it on my story if anyone was able to pick me up and take me. I was more so expecting someone I knew to respond, like my cousin or something. But I got a Snapchat back from this guy I'd never talked to before. Or at least his Bitmoji was a guy. But either way, I didn't know who it was. It said he was my friend on Snapchat, but we had never had a single conversation, or even shared any pictures back and forth before. He texted me something about how he was bored and had nothing better to do. I remember responding to him, asking if he even lived in the same state. It turns out he did, but the town he said he lived in was at least a 2-hour drive from me. I told him not to worry about it, and I didn't want him to drive 2 hours just to take me to the mall. But he quickly responded saying why not. At this point, the whole conversation felt off to me, but he insisted. I finally ended up agreeing. I told him he could come pick me up, but only if he was willing to send me a picture of himself. I was just trying to be cautious. A couple minutes later, he sent me a snap. I opened it, just to see some 30-year-old guy looking back at me. The guy had on a really dirty hat, smiling at the camera, though like half of his teeth were missing. The caption on the snap said he was on his way. I sat there for a second thinking it over in my head. How did the guy know where to pick me up? He didn't even ask for my address. That's when my heart dropped, realizing I had my Snap map on, meaning that anyone I had as a friend on the app could easily find my address. I panicked and quickly responded to the guy apologizing, saying I actually had a closer friend willing to take me. Now, obviously that wasn't true, but the fact that this guy was willing to drive 2 hours to pick someone up he had never even met before, just from their location on the Snap map alone, gave me an off vibe. Plus, the guy looked insanely creepy, definitely not someone I'd feel comfortable being around. The guy opened the snap a couple minutes later, but never responded. As far as I know, he never showed up. Though, I live in a cul-de-sac, and usually we wouldn't get any cars passing by our house. But I swear, for at least the next few days, there was this same black SUV that would constantly drive by. Whether that was related or not, I don't know. Though, about a month later, I was on Facebook scrolling through my feed. I passed a news story that had one of those attachments, meaning it was sourced on a different website. I almost always scroll past those things, but I couldn't help but stop for this one. There, on my Facebook feed, I could clearly see a picture of that guy from Snapchat. There was no doubt in my mind it was the same guy. The headline of the news story read that he was arrested for attempted murder. This whole experience makes me think I dodged a major bullet by trusting my gut and not accepting a ride from the guy. The whole situation shook me up for a while, and nowadays I try to be a lot smarter and only allow people I trust to see me on the Snap Map. I'm a female, and when I was a sophomore in high school, I took a lot of different classes. One of them I don't think I'll ever forget. It was a history class, and the regular teacher for the class had another job on top of teaching. And because of this, we would often get a substitute teacher for the class. It was always the same guy. I would say he was at least in his mid-50s. Nothing ever struck me as odd about him, since if I'm being honest, I rarely even ever paid attention in that class. That was until one day. I was in the middle of working on a project he assigned, but every time I looked up from my paper, he was just staring at me. Every time I would look at him, he wouldn't even break eye contact and try to play it off either. One of the times I looked up, I noticed he had his phone pointed in my direction. It looked like he was taking pictures of me. I of course was creeped out, but didn't say anything in case I was wrong. Anyway, a few weeks later, somehow, which I still don't know how to this day, the guy found my Snapchat username and added me. I knew it was him too, as he had his full name on the account. I didn't know what to do, but I still regret the decision I made. Knowing he had an influence on my grade, I ended up adding him back. A few minutes later, he sent me a snap saying hey. He had his face in it and everything. At this point, I knew something wasn't right. I took a screenshot of the snap and left him on read. He quickly followed up with another snap, this time a black screen with a question mark as the caption. I again left him on read and forgot about the whole situation. Over the next few weeks, there were multiple occasions where I would check the Snap Map just to see him not far away. And this would happen anywhere too, not just at school. I would be at the mall with my friends, for example, and see he just so happened to be at the same mall. Or even sometimes at school, when I knew for a fact he didn't work that day. Though, overall, for a solid month, nothing but those supposed coincidences took place regarding the whole situation. But of course, a few days later, I would get a random message from him. I could tell it was a chat this time, and not a regular snap. I opened it, and I was absolutely horrified. He sent around 50 pictures of me in pretty much any situation. Some were of me at school, but others, confirming my suspicion about him following me on the Snap Map, were of me not on school campus. Obviously, I left him on read, screenshotted everything, and blocked him. I instantly told my parents, and they notified both the school and the police. It's been 2 years since the situation. I'm a senior now, and ever since he sent the pictures, I'd never seen him again. I can only assume he was fired, as we actually got another substitute teacher who was really nice. Overall, the whole situation was really disturbing. The fact that I had someone following me around and taking pictures of me just based on my location on the Snap Map for a good month of my life absolutely terrifies me. I deleted Snapchat shortly after the whole experience, and like I said, I haven't seen the guy since, so I'm not entirely sure whatever ended up happening to him. This happened during the holiday season of 2014. Back then, I was in college, and because the campus was so close to my parents' home, I just lived with them to save money on rent. Ever since I was a kid, every holiday season my parents would take our family on a 2-hour drive to the next state over to see extended family. Their plan was to leave Friday morning, but because I had school, I had to drive myself down later that night, and that's what I ended up doing. I'd say it was around 8 p.m. when I left, so at that time of year almost completely dark outside. Anyway, I was driving down the highway which should be noted was almost completely dead. There wasn't much for civilization on the route I was taking. I remember going for around an hour, when my car started making weird noises. I honestly just tried to ignore it, as the car was old, so it would occasionally do that. But eventually it started slowing down. I literally put the pedal to the floor, but it didn't do anything. That's when my heart dropped, realizing I was out of gas. I meant to fill up on my way back from school, but completely forgot. And like a lot of other things on the car, the gas light was broken, so I had no reminder. Only about a 20-minute walk away was a small town that I knew for a fact had a 24-hour gas station, so I guess things could have been worse. I started my walk, and when I finally made it there, I quickly bought a container, filled it up, and started walking back. Fast forward another 20-minute walk, and I made it back to my car. I filled it up and got inside. But right as I started my car, the headlights revealed some man maybe 50 feet in front of me. Like, no car, just this guy that came from the exact same direction as I had only a couple minutes ago. When he got to my car, he started making a hand signal to tell me to roll down my window. Now, my first instinct was to drive off, but he was leaning on the front hood of my car, and I didn't want to hurt the dude. So I rolled down my window only an inch to hear what he had to say, and possibly get him to move just enough for me to drive off without hitting him. But no, he stayed right on my car. He then asked me if I could give him a ride, as his car had broken down just up the road. But I knew for a fact this was most likely a lie. I had just walked from that direction, and I didn't see any broken down car. I responded saying,
Sorry dude, I gotta get going.
There was silence for a bit, until the guy went on about feeling tired, and if I could at least give him a water or something. I told him sure, and reached over to my glove box where I keep extra waters. Like I expected, he moved closer to my window, and now off my car. Figuring this might be my only opportunity to get away, I hit the gas and sped out of there. As I was pulling away, I heard an ear-deafening scraping sound on the side of my car. Along with this, the guy started chasing my car for a bit until giving up. Most disturbing, though, was the fact that nowhere on the side of the road was a broken down car. I firmly believe that man had followed me on my walk from the gas station back to my own car. When I finally made it to my cousin's house, I got out and noticed the entire side of my car had been scraped by what looked like a knife or some sort of sharp object. Ultimately, I reported the incident to the police, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. There are some nights in your life that are very hard to forget. I had one of these nights approximately 20 years ago. I was a 17-year-old male, and I was planning on staying out all night with a couple of high school friends of mine. I'll call them Paul and Alex for now. All three of us had relatively strict parents who wouldn't want us out late, and at the time there was a 1 a.m. curfew for people under 18 anyway. So Paul, Alex, and I decided to each pull the old trick of telling our parents that we were sleeping over at one another's house. We talked about how much fun it would be to have no set time to come home, and to be completely free for a night. I decided to be the driver. I had an old Camaro that was as souped up as I could possibly get it on a 17-year-old salary. It was in good shape, and we figured it would be fun to mess around in on that particular night. Anyway, I picked up Paul and Alex. From what I can remember, it was around 10 o'clock at night, and we were off to see where the night would take us. We aimlessly drove around for a while. We stopped for some food, and cruised around the local area until we started to get bored. The night seemed longer than we anticipated. Eventually, we decided it would be fun to drive to a neighboring state's tourist area, and we then drove 45 minutes or so till we got there. I don't recall too much going on at the time we arrived. It was probably 2 in the morning by then. Come around 3 o'clock and we were again starting to get bored, but that wouldn't last long. We were driving down an unlit street. Other than the illumination from my headlights and the dim lights from houses or businesses that were set far from the street, it was complete darkness. There were lines of parked cars on both sides of the congested area, and that's when I noticed one had pulled out of a parking space behind me and was now following me. The car had no lights on and was slowly getting closer to my bumper. Alex and Paul were constantly looking back at the vehicle. I remember all of us asking each other what we thought was happening. Keep in mind, we were naive 17-year-olds back then. But as I looked into my rearview mirror, I noticed there were actually 2 vehicles tailing us, one behind the other. We had no cell phones back then, but luckily I had an eager engine, and I wasn't afraid to make use of it. We all agreed it would be best to try to make it to the highway to see if we could lose them. Before we knew it, the car right behind us started putting his lights on, then off, and then on again. He tried to bump us on a few occasions, which forced us to start blowing through stop signs and lights. We were now on a large main highway, both vehicles still following us. One of them was side by side with us for a moment, and I remember looking over, and me and the driver locked eyes for a moment. The guy just smiled at me. His face genuinely disturbed me. Meanwhile, the other car was right behind us and pushing us to speeds of around 90 miles an hour. They were both clearly trying to hit my car, one from the back and the other from the side. I then punched the gas somewhere around 100 miles an hour, in a speed limit zone close to half that. We were able to get a few car lengths ahead of them, when we passed by two police cars side by side. One of them immediately pulled out with his lights on. This was the only time in my life I've ever been relieved to get pulled over. As I was coming to a stop, I looked behind us and noticed the two vehicles that were following us practically vanished. There was only the patrol vehicle. When the officer came to my window, I told him everything. He was in the middle of telling us we were breaking our curfew when one of the cars sped by us. I frantically told the officer that was one of the cars, and he radioed another officer who was able to pull him over further down the road. A short while later, the officer that pulled us over would inform us that we were right, and that the guys following us were known carjackers in the area, and were both caught and currently being arrested. He then issued me a speeding ticket, and told us we should have just pulled over and locked the doors and windows. But, at least the way I see it, I much rather would have gotten a speeding ticket than my car stolen. I'm 23 and live in a semi-rural area. There's not really much to do on weekends, so every once in a while I'll go meet up with a couple of friends in the nearest city, which is maybe a 45-minute drive. This weekend, I decided to do exactly that. I left around 6 p.m. and stayed in town till around midnight. Everything was normal until about 5 minutes into my drive back home. Now, something that needs to be mentioned is I'm not a night owl by any means. So, needless to say, midnight felt pretty late to me. I'll admit I was tired. In all honesty, the only thing on my mind was getting home so I could go to bed. Anyway, I'm driving on the highway, doing my best to keep myself awake, when I see some man in the middle of the road running towards my car waving their arms around. Mind you, I'm going around 70 miles an hour at this point. But somehow, I was able to see the guy in time to slam on the brakes and come to a stop on the shoulder of the road before hitting him. I laid on the horn in frustration, completely unaware at this point how odd it was for a man to be out on the highway in the middle of the night. It wasn't until the guy looked directly at the driver's side window and started walking toward my car did I suddenly realize how bizarre and possibly dangerous the whole situation was. The guy was somewhere around 30 years old and profusely sweating. He looked incredibly panicked, and when I rolled down my window, he explained to me that he needed a ride home while simultaneously attempting to open the locked passenger side door. I asked him where he was going, or where he was even coming from, and to this he explained to me that if I let him in the car, he would tell me. Everything about the whole encounter was off, and so for my own safety, I ultimately decided I wasn't going to give this guy a ride. I told him this, but didn't want to just strand the guy, so I asked him if there was anyone he knew that I could call to come pick him up. In response to this, the guy started crying and full-on banging on my car in frustration. And at that, I sped away. Looking in my rearview mirror, I noticed the guy attempting to chase my car, but quickly fading into the distance. After maybe 5 minutes, I called 911 to report the guy. I informed the operator that somebody had been running in the middle of the highway. I also gave his description and explained how he had begged me for a ride, and when I drove away started chasing me. The next morning, I called the police department for a follow-up to my call, and it turns out the officer who responded to it found the guy. Apparently he was found again running in the middle of the road. What disturbs me most is the fact that the guy was identified to be responsible for an armed robbery of a nearby gas station just 30 minutes before my encounter with him. I'm pretty confident that at the time the guy was under the influence of something. I mean, I've never seen somebody act like that. Thinking back on the whole experience makes me wonder what this guy really had planned if I had let him in my car, especially considering he was armed. Every once in a while, I like to go what I call minimalist camping. It's basically the type of camping where you only take what is absolutely necessary to survive. It's definitely not for everyone, but I see it as a fun challenge. I mean, oftentimes I won't even take a tent, just a tarp to lay on the ground. I did exactly this over one June weekend. I was alone and in the middle of the forest. Now, it wasn't like a campsite. I usually try to stay away from those. I much prefer a completely uninhabited part of the forest. Usually what I'll do is park in some random spot on the side of this forest road. I'll then walk out at least a mile and camp where I'm stood. Or sometimes if I find a small body of water, I'll camp next to that. Anyway, it was the first night of this specific trip. By this point, it was already dark. I was laying down next to a fire I created with a small fire starter kit that I had brought when it started to rain. Now, again, I didn't have a tent. I would not be able to last the night in the rain. To make things worse, I checked the weather for the weekend the night before, and no rain was shown. I guess that just goes to show how inaccurate those predictions can be. It was only sprinkling, but I knew if it got worse, I'd just have to call the whole trip and go home. Of course, it did get worse. It started absolutely pouring out. And to make things even worse still, thunder and lightning both started going off nearby. So I packed up what little I had and started jogging back to my car through the dark forest, only lit by a dim flashlight I had in my hand and the occasional lightning flash. Fortunately, I made it back to my parked car relatively quickly. In order to see anything in front of me, I had to put the windshield wipers on their max setting. I had about 10 to 12 miles on this secluded and narrow 2-lane road in the forest with no streetlights before I would make it back to a main road. I was only about 2 miles in when I rounded a corner and saw a Subaru with a small trailer parked diagonally across the road. The way in which it was parked completely blocked me from getting by. I couldn't even go off the road to get around it because there were trees on either side. I wasn't able to see inside the car, so I turned on my high beams. This revealed a man slouched over in the driver's seat, his head uncomfortably resting on the steering wheel. From the looks of it, he was completely unconscious. Just then, lightning struck. The flash revealed another man just out of the view of my headlights. He was outside, laying face down on the road in some puddles. He too looked unconscious. An immediate sense of unease overwhelmed me. The scene was too perfect. I mean, the car and its trailer just so happened to block the entire road after a bad accident, and everyone involved became unconscious. I was seeing a lot of red flags. I had always heard stories of people playing dead in the middle of the road as a way to lure unsuspecting people out of their cars for some sinister purpose. I decided I wanted no part of this. I began reversing to find a spot where the trees gave me enough room to make a 3-point turn. My eyes kept darting back and forth from my rearview mirror to the Subaru. Just when I got back far enough, I turned my head back towards the Subaru one last time, and my blood ran cold. The man that was in the driver's seat and the man that was lying on the road were now both running full speed towards my car. Meanwhile, more men were jumping out of the trailer and proceeding to do the same. There had to have been at least 5 or 6 guys all running towards me. I was still completing the turn. When they got close enough, they started aggressively yanking on the door handles. But I had them locked. I threw it in drive and barreled out of there. I was forced to take a longer route back home. For that drive, I swear I had my eyes on the rearview mirror checking to see if I was being followed, more than I had them on the road in front of me. When I did get home and had a second to calm down, I called the police. Though they didn't find anyone or even anything matching the descriptions I gave. And I'm not sure anything's gonna come of it. I didn't get a license plate number, and it was too rainy to make out any facial features. Something I did take note of though, is from what I could see, they didn't have any weapons. Rather, they had stuff like ropes, handcuffs, and tape. You'd think people doing this would just want to rob you, and admittedly that's probably how it goes for most of these cases. But I truly believe this time was different. I don't know what they wanted to do, but something tells me it was worse than being robbed. The house I grew up in was very large. My bedroom was on the second floor, and its window overlooked the driveway and neighborhood street it was attached to. At the time, my bed was placed almost right up against this window. I was around 15 or 16 when this happened. Both of my parents were out of town on some vacation, and I have no siblings, so this meant I was home alone. As a teen, I tended to stay up late, sometimes doing homework, but oftentimes browsing social media or texting friends. It was somewhere around 4 a.m., and I was doing just that while lying in bed. Now, I have to mention, it had been raining with the occasional distant sound of thunder for pretty much the whole night, and being on the second floor, it was pretty loud. But even this didn't drown out the sound of what I can only describe as slight knocks on glass. Like I mentioned earlier, my bed was right up against the window. The sound was right next to my ear, so naturally I assumed it came from the window. To be completely honest, it sounded very different from the rain hitting the window. But I told myself I was on the second floor. It had to have been the rain. I mean, what else could it have been? So I sat there and completely brushed it off. Fast forward 30 minutes, and I was still awake lying in bed on my phone. All of a sudden, I heard the all-too-familiar humming sound made when the garage door to the house is opening. I was more confused than anything. It was 4:30 a.m., and here I am lying in bed while the garage door is being randomly opened. I figured something with the electricals must have been glitching because of the storm, so I got up out of bed to go and shut it again. I made it about halfway down the stairs when I stopped. In the corner of the kitchen, I could see some figure wearing all black and crouched down, but I couldn't tell if what I was seeing was real. I stood there for probably 20 more seconds, waiting for the next lightning strike to provide enough light to see. My heart sank. It was very clearly a person, but I couldn't tell if they were looking in my direction or not. I decided rather than making a run for it, I played off like I forgot something upstairs. I patted my pockets as if I was looking for my phone and turned around to go back up the stairs. When I got to my room, I shut the door, locked it, and pushed my dresser in front of it. Immediately after, I called my dad. On what had to have been the last ring, he picked up in a groggy voice. I sternly asked him if anyone was expected to show up to the house, because someone was downstairs. Sounding more concerned this time, he said, No one's supposed to be in the house. He told me to stay on the line while he called the cops using my mom's phone. I didn't hear anything in the 7 or so minutes it took police to arrive. But to be fair, it was still raining really hard, which drowned out a good amount of the noise. As police were searching the house, they found a grimy-looking man hiding behind a set of boxes in the basement. In his possession was one of our large kitchen knives and one of those garage openers you put in your car. As it turns out, my dad's car was broken into while he was at work a few months back. And included in what was stolen was, of course, one of our garage openers. We never found out who was responsible, but I guess now we know. Though how he actually found which garage it went to, we have no idea. We also don't know what he had planned to do that night while I was home alone. This happened outside of an old house I used to live in 8 years ago. The house was a few miles outside of a small town with very little people. And because of the location, the house had no neighbors whatsoever. You could say I was in the middle of nowhere, because it pretty much was. In front of the house was a road, and in the back was a forest that continued for miles on end. And it was empty. There were no trails, no one was living there, no reason really for anyone being there. I was 26 at the time, and was really into filming and photography. I particularly liked night photography. One night, there was a thunderstorm outside in the distance. The air was humid, but it wasn't raining. Being into photography and having a pretty decent camera, I thought I'd try to capture some of the lightning. I needed everything around me to be as dark as possible for the best shot, so I moved the camera set about back behind the house where there was less light, specifically in a spot where I'd have a clear view of the skyline. The house had this fairly small metal fence with a gate, which I guess marked the backyard. Only about 50 feet from the gate was the tree line of the forest. I sat there inside the fence for maybe a good hour and got some pretty good shots of the lightning strikes. There was almost no wind, and the only sound you could hear was the occasional thunder rumbling. While sitting there, I felt the urge to relieve myself, so I opened the gate and walked over towards the tree line. I was standing there for maybe 30 seconds. I was almost done when I heard something. I couldn't make it out at first, but I remember I got a strange feeling about it. It did not sound natural. I stood still looking into the forest for a few seconds, but I couldn't see anything. The clouds had moved more towards the house by this point, and it had now begun to drizzle. I turned around towards the house as I had to get my camera equipment inside to keep it from getting wet. But just as I turned around, I heard the sound again. This time it sounded like leaves rustling under footsteps. Again, I stopped for a second. I thought I had actually heard breathing now. Like really close to me. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, but as another lightning strike lit up the sky, I could see for a brief second. Some figure was stood perfectly still just feet away from me, slightly behind a tree branch. It was just looking into the ground. The only thing I remembered was that I ran, jumped the fence, and went into the house so quickly that I didn't even notice I'd scratched on my leg pretty bad in the process. That's when I realized I'd left all of my camera equipment outside in the rain, so I forced myself to go back out there. The whole time, I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line, looking for any movement. I grabbed the camera and backed into the house before locking every single door and window. That night, I didn't sleep very well. A few hours after I'd gotten into bed, I again heard the sound. Footsteps, this time walking around the outside of the house. I didn't move at all. I stayed as still as I could. Come morning, and that was it. Nothing else happened. I never heard or saw anything again after that. I still have no idea what I saw that night. No one should have been out there. I mean, again, all of this happened in basically the middle of nowhere. This was by far the scariest thing that I experienced in the 20 or so years I lived in that house. When I was around the age of 9, every Thursday over the summer months, my grandpa would take me to the movie theater to see whatever new movie was out at the time. Because we would typically go in the morning to early afternoon, there weren't usually that many other people. In fact, this one time we had the whole theater to ourselves. I remember we picked out 2 seats in one of the back rows, as I guess we saw those as the best seats in the entire theater. I don't exactly remember what movie we were watching. This was a very long time ago. As we continued watching it though, no one else showed up. Typically, you'll get a few late people funneling in shortly after the movie has already started, but this didn't happen. We genuinely had the entire theater to ourselves. At about the halfway point in the movie, my grandpa had to use the bathroom. Not wanting to interrupt me watching it, he let me stay by myself while he was gone. Around 30 seconds after he left, I could see someone walk into the theater out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head to see who it was, as I really didn't think my grandpa would have been that fast. It was a man in probably his early 30s wearing one of the striped employee uniforms. We locked eyes for a few seconds. He then walked over to the emergency exit and propped it open with something, leaving a clear stream of daylight shining in the room. After that, he walked back up towards the main exit of the theater and left. I remember at the time not thinking much about it. I wasn't bothered by it at all, actually. My focus was shifting back towards the movie when the light from the door suddenly grew. I looked back over at it and the door was now wide open. Another man had opened it from the outside. He proceeded to shine a dim flashlight in the theater, looking around. Eventually, it landed on me. He then turned it off and started giving me that finger gesture, indicating me to come to him. Now, again, you have to remember, I was around 9 years old at the time. I did pretty much anything any adult told me to. I had never really been given the talk about not trusting strangers. You have to understand that back then was a much different time. Strangers weren't really made out to be as much of a concern as they are today. So I got up out of my seat and started walking down towards the exit door. The guy introduced himself as John and was really friendly, or at least that's how he was trying to come off as. He then explained how he had just finished up a movie in a different theater and had some leftover candy he didn't finish eating, which he thought he'd offer to me instead of throwing away. My 9-year-old eyes lit up with excitement. I told him I was interested. He then explained to me that all the candy was in his trunk. He grabbed my hand with a firm grip and started leading me to the only car in this secluded off parking lot we were in that was on the back side of the building. As we got closer, he reached in his pocket and grabbed a set of keys which he used to open the trunk of the car. The lid to the trunk opened and revealed an assortment of different candy bars. He told me to crawl inside and pick whichever ones I wanted. But right as I started crawling in, the exit door to the building burst open and my grandpa started aggressively yelling at the guy. This caught me completely off guard. Up until that point, I had never heard my grandpa yell before. In reaction, I backed away from the trunk. The guy then ran over to the driver's side door, got in and floored it onto there with the trunk still open, all in a matter of seconds. I started crying, not realizing at the time what had really just almost occurred. My grandpa, now in a comforting voice, tried to calm me down. Nowadays, I can only imagine the stress he went through when he returned from the bathroom just to see I was no longer there. I would later learn that the only reason he knew where I had gone was because the guy had left the exit door propped open just a crack after luring me outside. My grandpa called the cops shortly after the incident, but the car I was being lured into had no plates on it. On top of that, it was an extremely common car to see on the road at the time. So, while he did give a description of it, it was ultimately never found. He of course gave a description of what little he saw of the man too, but he was also never found. As for the employee that had originally propped open the door from the inside, after further investigation, it turns out that man was never an employee in the first place. Therefore, he too was also never found. Fortunately though, this was a one-off occurrence. It was never tried on any other children in the building that day, or at any point as far as we were told. I'm actually pretty sure they installed an alarm system for the emergency exits after that day, but I'm not entirely sure, as we've never been back to that movie theater after this. When I was 16, I got my first job at a local movie theater in my town. At the time I was hired, the place was in desperate need of people who could work closing shifts, which I actually preferred, so it worked out perfectly. The place wasn't that big, and so it was manageable to work the shift by yourself, depending on the day of the week, but typically I'd be scheduled with 1 or 2 other people. It was a Tuesday night, and the last showings were wrapping up. Another kid, Noah, who was around my age, was working with me. We were the only 2 working that night, and were expected to get everything set and ready for the openers the next morning. Time went on, and eventually it got to the point where the movies had all been finished up for a while now. I began checking all the theaters to make sure nobody had fallen asleep, which actually happens a lot more frequently than you would think. Now, to manually control the lights in the theaters, we had to go on the opposite side of the building. So, to get it done faster, I would usually just do the checks in the dark, using only the flashlight on my phone for light. I had finished checking all of the theaters but one. I walked in and once again turned on the flashlight on my phone. I'll usually start at the front row and make my way back up. I got down there, but before I started searching, I stopped. I stood completely still for a second. I could hear breathing. At first, I thought it was coming from the vents, but the more I listened, the more I realized that was definitely human breathing. I shot my flashlight up and out towards the row of seats. I didn't see anybody. I could feel my heart sink to my chest. Clearly, someone was deliberately hiding from me. I wanted to call out to them, but I was too scared. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I stood there for a while, completely frozen, just listening, and then decided to play it off like I didn't hear anything. I walked back to the stairs, went up them, and exited the theater. Right when I got out, I sprinted back to the main area. I found Noah at the concession stand and told him what I had just heard. Neither of us wanted to go back there. We both decided to just wait by the front doors. We figured whoever it was would have to leave at some point, so when they did, we'd see them walking out the front door and then we'd finish closing up. We waited for literally somewhere around an hour. Meanwhile, not a single person walked past us and out those front doors. By this point, we both just wanted to go home. We built up enough courage to search each theater again, but this time we took the time to manually turn on the lights. One by one, we went through the theaters. Nobody. There was literally nothing out of the ordinary. I thought it was possible they had left through one of the emergency exits, as some moviegoers will do that for one reason or another. So as we were checking the theaters, I also checked all of the exits, but none of them had been used. I could tell because there was about an inch of snow on the ground at the time, and there were no footprints leading away from any of the exits. No one had opened those doors. I was sure of it. Noah began to question my story, and I'll be honest, I even began to question it. He ended up convincing me that I must have just been hearing things, or maybe the speakers were malfunctioning for a short period of time. I accepted this reasoning, and so we closed up and both went home. Fast forward to the next day, and just like the night before, I was again scheduled for a closing shift with Noah. Now, as closers, we had to vacuum the hallways before we could leave. I usually tried to do this much earlier in my shift, but this night I was too busy to get to it until later. Anyway, I was vacuuming when it started making these weird noises, and I noticed it was no longer picking up most of the spilled popcorn on the ground. The vacuum was pretty cheap, so this didn't exactly surprise me. Plus, we had a spare in one of the back closets that I knew I could use. I went up front to get the keys and began walking over to the closet. As I was doing so, it hit me that I had never actually been in most of the closets back here. In my training, I wasn't told much more about them, other than that there was a backup vacuum in one of them that I could use if I needed it. I got to the door and put the key in to unlock it, but I was surprised to find it was already unlocked. I then opened the door and shuffled my hand around on the side of the wall feeling for a light switch, but I stopped myself. This huge, unbearable wave of stench smacked me in the face. I took a couple steps back just so that I could breathe fresh air again. That's when, from in the back of the closet, I could hear moving. It sounded like something was rustling around back there. I closed the door and this time locked it. The next few minutes consisted of me running around the building looking for Noah. When I found him, I told him about the closet. His facial expression immediately changed.
Dude, you don't think that has something to do with yesterday, do you?
Up until that moment, I had completely forgotten about yesterday. The thought of the two occurrences being linked didn't even cross my mind.
I think we should call the cops.
I agreed. We sat outside as we waited for them. When they arrived, I told them about the night before and now this night. We then gave them the keys to the closet and directions on how to get there. We again proceeded to wait outside. 10 minutes passed, when all of a sudden at least 5 other cop cars sped into the parking lot. One of them began questioning us, while the rest of them ran inside. At one point he asked us for our manager's phone number. They ended up calling him, asking him to show up. Now, by this point we still didn't even know what the cops had found, and honestly neither of us really wanted to know. But it wasn't long before we would find out. The cops came out of the front doors with a deranged-looking woman. From what I've been told, when the cops opened the closet door, they were immediately met by this woman holding a knife. She jumped at them, but was ultimately overpowered by the officers. She would be detained, and in the process, police would find 2 decaying dead bodies, a man and a woman, stuffed in the back corner of the closet. That's as much as we were informed of. At that point, our manager had shown up, and we were told that we could leave, which I gladly did. I quit that job the very next day, which my manager was completely understanding of. Thinking back on this situation makes me sick to my stomach. As for Noah, I'm not really sure. I never talked to him after that night. This happened back when I was in high school. My friends and I used to always love going to our local movie theater that was situated inside of our town's shopping mall. Typically, we'd go in big groups, but this time it was only my friend Avery and I. We picked a late showing of some weird movie that I can't remember the name of. For whatever reason, this theater stayed open really late into the night. I don't know why, as it didn't get much, if any, business past, say, 11 o'clock. Well, other than ours, of course, as we'd always pick the latest showings. As I expected, when we arrived, there was no one else in the theater. We picked out 2 seats in one of the front rows, and after the previews, started watching the movie. Something I probably should have mentioned is, before we walked into the theater, I had bought one of those large soda fountain drinks. I really shouldn't have done this though. It wasn't even a quarter way through the movie when I really had to use the bathroom. I told Avery and got up to go do so. I got to the bathrooms and opened the door. Now, these bathrooms were ones that didn't have automatic lights. You had to physically turn on and off the light switch yourself. The lights were off, so I was surprised to see someone inside when I walked in. It was a man. I couldn't tell you how old he was. He was just standing sort of next to the sinks, in what was only a second ago the complete dark. We made short eye contact for a second before I went to go do my business. I got done and went to go wash my hands. The guy was still standing there in the same position. I started walking out, and the guy did the same. I started walking back to the theater, and again he did the same. He followed me inside and watched me sit down next to Avery. He stood there for a few minutes before walking to our same row and sitting down literally 1 seat away from us, as in there was only 1 seat that separated me and this guy. Again, this was a theater that was completely empty. He could have chosen anywhere else to sit. During one of the louder scenes of the movie, Avery asked me in a whisper if I knew the guy. I told her about the bathrooms, and she agreed it was weird, especially considering the guy wasn't even here to watch the first part of the movie. But we both decided to just stick it out for the rest of it. As the movie continued, things got a little weirder. The guy kept looking over at us every few minutes. Like, even just from the corner of my eye, I could clearly tell he was doing it. In no way was he trying to be discreet about it. Finally, the end credits started. Avery and I both got up right away and started walking towards the exit. But as we should have expected by now, so did the guy. He was practically speed walking just to keep up with us. We got in the halls and they were completely empty. I didn't even see any employees, so we just walked as fast as we could out of the door and towards our car in the parking lot. We got to our car, and as we were backing up, we saw the man get in a blue Dodge Charger. I sped out of the parking lot and drove towards the nearest main street. I told Avery to keep a lookout to see if he was following us, but he was already gone. As far as we could see, there was no one else out on the road but us. A wave of relief hit us. We started talking about how scary that was. Like, that guy was clearly following us. And he obviously wasn't there to watch the movie. I mean, he missed the whole first part of it. Our thoughts were then interrupted by a car with its brights on that pulled up right behind us at a red light. We both looked back to see if it was the same blue Dodge Charger. But we couldn't tell. All we could see were these blinding headlights. That's when the driver's side door swung open and a man started running full speed towards our car. It was the same guy from before. He started aggressively yanking on our car's door handles until he eventually pulled out a knife and began jabbing at one of the windows. I slammed on the gas, running the red light before he could break it. I turned right onto the next street and started making random turns to lose the guy. Fortunately, this seemed to work. We both sat parked on the side of the road for a few minutes with the car lights off, catching our breath. We waited a long time before continuing on towards our houses, and we took side streets the whole way there. We each ended up telling our parents, who collectively decided to report it to the police. During their investigation, police would contact the manager of the movie theater. As it turns out, that movie theater had security cameras, something which I didn't know. But at no point that night was the man seen on any of the cameras. Granted, all of the cameras were near the main entrance to the building, but this just means he had to have entered through a fire exit or some other way that wasn't the main entrance. Because of this, he hasn't been identified. This happened back when I was 15. It was the middle of summer, and at the time this took place, both of my parents were out of town on a 4-day-long business trip. I'm an only child, so this meant I had the house to myself. By the second night, I was pretty bored, so I figured I'd invite my friend Justin over to stay the night. I called him up and he agreed. But by this point, it was already pretty late, so he said it might take him a while because he didn't have a ride and would have to walk. Fast forward 30 minutes and he arrived. We went up to my room and started playing Xbox. This probably went on for a couple hours when Justin perked up and recalled a cave that he had stumbled upon while walking over here. I guess something in the game we were playing had somehow reminded him of it or something. I'm not really sure. And I had no reason not to believe him. We lived in a small town in the mountains where caves are somewhat common. He went on to suggest that we explore it. I was getting bored of playing Xbox, so 15-year-old me thought it was a good idea and agreed. Now, remember, this all occurred at night. The two of us went around the house looking for flashlights and anything else we thought we might need. We then headed out. I basically just followed Justin, trusting his guidance. Eventually, he took a sharp turn off the road and directly into the dense trees of the forest. Then, after a few minutes, we saw it. It was extremely hidden behind some trees. The mouth of the cave was pretty small, think like a bit smaller than a doorway. We walked in, and we quickly discovered that other people had been here before. There were plastic bottles, chip bags, and other convenience store junk. As we walked further inside, we got hit with this horrible putrid smell. Describing it in words wouldn't do it justice, like it was actually that bad. We put our jackets over our noses and did our best to ignore it. My flashlight then revealed what looked to be the source. Lying against the wall of the cave was a large black garbage bag. Somewhat next to that was a makeshift bed and multiple fast food bags, some of which still had food inside. I started to panic a bit, realizing a homeless guy might be living here. Justin started to look at the fast food bags to see how fresh the food was. But that's when he noticed something. There was this photo album looking thing with a black cover. Justin opened the first page and shined his flashlight on it. Before I even got a chance to look, he dropped it out of disgust.
Dude, there are pictures of dead bodies in there.
I almost didn't want to believe what he said, but I didn't want to look for myself. I was looking up at Justin when a blinding white flash lit up the entire cave for not but a split second. Both of our heads shot in the direction of the noise. We didn't dare shine our flashlights toward whatever it was. Instead, we turned around and ran back to the entrance, literally as fast as we could go. When we got back outside, we made a break for the road. We didn't stop until we got back to my house. We locked all the doors and windows before discussing what exactly we had just witnessed. We agreed there had to have been someone in there with us. Realistically, we knew that flash couldn't have been anything other than a camera flash. The next morning, we called the police and reported what we saw. When they investigated the same cave, they found nothing but the plastic bottles, chip bags, and convenience store junk that we had found when we first entered. They didn't find any makeshift bed, black trash bag, photo album, or most importantly, any person. So, naturally, nothing came of it. Why whoever was in that cave felt the need to take our picture, I'll never know 100%. But the older I get, the more red flags the whole situation gives off. Like, what was in that black trash bag to give off such a putrid smell? Or why would there be an extremely graphic photo album? All the people I've talked to agree that this was more than just a homeless guy living in a cave. I was 22 when this happened. Me and two of my friends, Miles and Ruben, have always been outdoor people. For as long as we've known each other, we've always liked being outside and doing things that involved a bit of risk. One of those things was caving. One of our favorite spots was a secluded cave system that was essentially a huge underground maze of tight spaces and tunnels. The entrance was in an area of forest that was just off a beaten track, which was a good 10-minute walk from a gravel parking area where we usually parked. This time in particular, we decided to go onto the same cave system and try to explore some of the tunnels that we hadn't really been down before. Now, there weren't any drawn maps of the cave system, so instead we would use a set of rope that we attached to the entrance. We would take it with us as we went down, so that way we could easily find our way back up through the many different routes. We drove out to the gravel parking area. The place was empty, except for one car. It was a dirty white pickup. Though this wasn't unusual, plenty of people used the area for hiking and other outdoor activities. As we got our stuff, I glanced over at it and saw that there was a man sitting in the driver's seat, just watching us. Trying to be friendly, I gave him a thumbs up as we walked past, but he didn't even react to it. It was a bit odd, but I tried to ignore it as we carried on towards the cave system. As we were setting up and getting ready to head down, I glanced over my left shoulder thinking I'd seen something in the tree line. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves I would sometimes get before going into a cave. Anyway, the three of us went inside. There were a lot of narrow sections in the cave that took me by surprise, but nonetheless we were having fun. Eventually, we found this small area with a small waterfall. We all agreed to take a break and catch our breath. Afterwards, right when we were just about to continue exploring the area, something happened. I had the rope in my hand, when suddenly I felt a sharp tug before it went completely slack. Confused, we all pulled on the rope, and our hearts sank. The rope was completely loose, meaning it was cut by someone or something. We all agreed the best course of action would be to head back up to the surface, something which, without a rope as our guide, now seemed close to impossible. We were going to have to remember the exact route we took. I've never been in such a frantic state. We took multiple wrong turns, and trying to all turn around in there is not the easiest thing to do. But eventually, after what felt like days, we were all hit with a short wave of relief. We could now see the light from the surface, and a couple minutes later we were all out. But we were now again on edge. We desperately rushed to pack everything up. I was constantly looking around us for any sign of the person that cut our rope. And just as we were finishing up, I saw them. There were around 6 people, including the man from the pickup in the parking area, all standing in the tree line. My eyes were still adjusting to the daylight, but I could tell each of them were holding long knives. Miles and Ruben saw them too. We all ran as fast as we could back to our car. The whole while we didn't dare to look behind us. Back in the parking area, the pickup, now empty, was still the only thing apart from our car. We got in and got out of there. We haven't been back to that spot since. We still don't know who those people were. We never saw them again. When I was maybe 12 or 13, my family and I moved from a busy city to a pretty middle-of-nowhere type of house in the woods. To give you an idea, the school I transferred to, which was the closest one, took about 25 to 30 minutes to drive to. Needless to say, the change was night and day. At that point in my life, I had literally only ever lived in the city, so it was a big difference for me. However, I would get used to the change relatively quickly. Looking back, I think it was mostly just because I was a kid, and it sort of just gave me more free space to roam around. I don't really know how to explain it better than that. Anyway, not long after moving in, I would discover an old strip of abandoned mines in a section of forest that was only a couple miles from my house itself. It had tons of abandoned mining equipment, tracks, caves, trails, and that kind of stuff. And I mean, being a kid, this was essentially like finding a giant playground. I remember the next day at school, I told a few friends about it. Surprisingly, none of them had heard of it before. I really wanted to better explore it after school, and one of my friends, Jackson, agreed to go with me. Fast forward to the end of the school day, and we started walking over there. When we got there, we quickly started checking out all the different equipment. It was honestly really cool to see. A lot of the stuff was actually still intact, but you could tell the stuff wasn't still in use. Things were rusty and just generally not in the best condition. Eventually, Jackson suggested that we explore one of the caves. Initially, I was against it. They were pretty eerie. Looking inside, basically all you could see was a set of tracks that led straight into complete darkness. Plus, all we had for light were the flashlights on our phones, which really didn't light up much of anything. But regardless, I eventually agreed, so long as we didn't go so far deep to where we could no longer see the light from the entrance. Cut to around 2 minutes into our walk into the cave, and we were now pretty far in. The daylight from the entrance was no longer really lighting up anything in front of us. I told Jackson we should probably turn back. He agreed, so we started walking single file back towards the entrance. Jackson was leading, and I was trailing him. Only a moment passed when Jackson said,
"Whoa, who was that?"
I looked up from the ground as we walked, but I didn't see anything.
"Dude, I think I just saw someone. Why would anyone else be out here?"
At first, I thought he was trying to scare me, but the tone of his voice was too genuine. He went on to explain how he saw a man walk from the left side of the entrance to the right. We both just stood there, intently staring towards the entrance of the cave. That's when a head peeked around the corner looking inside. Jackson and I both instinctively dived towards the side of the cave, hiding against the wall in the darkness. All we could do was hope that the guy hadn't seen us. He stood there at the entrance for a few seconds. We both had a clear view of his silhouette against the light outside. To our horror, the man started walking down the cave. As he did so, he started laughing in this disturbing manner. I looked at Jackson. The only thing I could make out in the darkness were his eyes. But from that alone, I could tell he was just as scared as I was. Whoever this man was clearly did not have good intentions. Or at least that's what I gathered from both his body language and the way that he laughed. The man continued to walk further into the cave. Meanwhile, Jackson and I continued to stay as quiet as we could, lying against the wall. As he got closer, I could better make out what he looked like. He had short black hair, had on a black set of boots, and was wearing a dirty pair of overalls. I noticed he had something in his hand, but I couldn't tell what it was. When he got even closer still, I realized it was a revolver. I could now hear my heart beating in my ears. Even being as young as I was, I vividly remember seeing life memories flashing before my eyes. The guy then got maybe 12 feet from where we were standing and stopped. He looked around for a second. I could see him squinting his eyes so as to see further into the cave. Then, by some miracle, he turned around and started walking back towards the entrance. When he got there, he turned right and was now out of view. It looked like he had kept walking, but Jackson and I both agreed we weren't going to take any chances. I mean, what if he really did see us and was hiding by the exit waiting for us to leave? It was about to be dark, and while being alone in an abandoned mine in the dark was a scary thought, potentially having to confront this man was more so. Naturally, within what was about around the next hour or so, it got completely dark outside, making everything in the cave even darker than it already was. Of course, we didn't have any service on our phones to be able to call for help. In our minds, we would have, in all likelihood, just been fine to walk home right then and there. But again, we did not want to take any chances with that guy still potentially waiting for us at the entrance. It would be long, but Jackson and I both agreed to wait until midnight. We figured by that point there was a small chance we'd run into any trouble, so that's exactly what we did. It was close to 5 hours of just sitting there in complete darkness, with the both of us still utterly terrified. When midnight finally came, we both got up and slowly started walking towards the entrance. We didn't dare to turn on the flashlights on our phones. Slowly, we creeped forward. Jackson was in front of me. We were now only a few steps away from the entrance, when out of nowhere, Jackson started sprinting. I was terrified. I didn't know what he saw, but I started sprinting as well just behind him. We went straight into a set of trees and in the direction of my house. After running for what felt like forever, my house finally started coming into view. Then I would begin to see flashing red and blue lights from multiple police cars. I saw an officer speaking to my parents. Jackson and I both frantically ran up to them with tears in our eyes and did our best to explain everything. Seeing the police cars really put into perspective for me how close we were to becoming the next missing person cases. There's absolutely no way our bodies would have been found in that cave. I'm sure of that. Over the next couple of weeks, police would search the abandoned mines and surrounding area for any sign of the man we described. However, their search would unfortunately yield no results. That man has yet to be found. From that day on, I chose not to go outside much, purely out of fear. If I did go somewhere, I would tell my parents exactly where, with the exact time I'd leave and be back. For those wondering, I later talked to Jackson about why he started running when he got close to the entrance of the cave. Disturbingly, he would tell me how he thought he saw the man crouched down. But again, it was dark. I'm not really sure how it's possible he could have seen that, so take it how you will. What I will add though, and something I never told anyone, including Jackson, was how, while we were running, I thought I heard a third pair of footsteps running behind us. Even to this day, I think back to that exact moment and try to decipher whether those were real footsteps I was hearing, or whether it was just my imagination.
This 101 focuses on engaging your students in writing, coding. Everybody get under your desk.
This took place 2 years ago, and I can still recall every moment in almost perfect detail. It was nearing the end of school. Everyone was on their way to their last period, which for me was history, a class that I not only wasn't good at, but I also disliked the teacher, and at that point I honestly had no motivation of even showing up. So, ultimately, I decided to ditch and hide out in one of the bathroom stalls located near the very back of the school. Almost no one went back there, so I figured no one would find out anyway. I was in the furthest back stall, playing some game on my phone, when the ear-deafening sound of the principal coming over the intercom made me jump.
Lockdown, lockdown. This is an emergency alert. Please follow lockdown procedures. Go into the nearest room or building, lock the door, and turn off all lights.
It was a lockdown announcement, though I honestly didn't pay it any attention, considering they were all practice, and so I just continued to sit there in the stall and wait. But just then, all the lights to the building seemingly shut off all at once. The hum of the light faded, along with the buzzing of the AC unit, which meant all the power to the school had been cut off. The bathroom had gone pitch black, and that's when I was actually starting to get worried. Power was never cut off during practice lockdown drills. I texted my friend asking him what was going on, and literally right away he answered back with a text saying,
Dude, where are you? It's a real lockdown. Everyone's asking where you are.
I told him I was in the bathroom, and he responds saying I should hide. But where else could I go? I wasn't just gonna run out into the hallway to find a better spot. So ultimately I decided to stay and hide in the stall I was in. I turned my phone's brightness down and texted my friend again. I asked him what the reason was for the lockdown, and after 5 long minutes of waiting, he replied saying that apparently there was a kid armed with a knife banging on classroom doors and asking to be let in. Both my classroom and the bathroom I was in were on the same floor, so I turned off my phone and tried my best to see if I could hear anything. There were running footsteps, and that was shortly followed by the sound of the bathroom door opening. I was absolutely horrified at what I was hearing. Whoever entered walked towards the stall next to me, went inside, and shut the door. I held my breath for what seemed like forever. Then, to break the silence, in a shaky voice, I said,
Who's in here?
It was silent for a second, and then I heard a voice reply with,
I'm just looking for a place to hide. I heard there was a lockdown over the speakers.
That didn't really answer my question, but the guy sounded around my age, and so I decided I'd just let it go. We sat in silence for what seemed like forever, when finally we got another announcement telling all students to exit the school in an orderly fashion through the front doors, where cops would be waiting outside. I exited the stall, but was surprised to see the guy next to me didn't. I asked him if he was coming, and he replied saying,
Yeah man, just give me a couple minutes.
I thought that was weird, but regardless, I left the bathroom and started heading towards the front exit of the school. As I was walking, my phone went off. My friend had texted me. He said that apparently a kid who was maybe a couple years older than us tried to rob a nearby gas station at knife point. The guy actually stabbed a couple people, and when he was unsuccessful in getting any money, he ran to hide in our school to blend in as one of the students. But what horrified me the most was the last sentence. My friend said that the cops outside were saying that the kid was still inside, and that he was hiding somewhere in the back of the school. Reading this changed my walk to the front doors into a full-on sprint. Right as I got outside, I would frantically inform one of the police officers of what I had experienced. And after they searched the bathroom, they found it was empty, but that the window inside was broken. The kid had broken and escaped through the window. Needless to say, for the next few school days, I had gotten a lot of unwanted attention because of what I had experienced. As far as I know, the kid still hasn't been caught, and it's still just difficult for me to come to terms with the fact that I was unknowingly hiding in a stall right next to the guy I was trying to hide from. I somewhat recently got my first real job as a teacher at a public elementary school in a nearby neighborhood. It was the first school year I was teaching, and at this point it was only September, so needless to say, I was still learning the ropes. It was honestly pretty stressful. I teach a first grade class of around 20 kids, so you can imagine how chaotic it would get at times, especially with my lack of experience. I remember one day, I was in the middle of assigning the kids a worksheet for spelling simple words, when the principal's voice came over the school's loudspeaker and ordered a lockdown. Now, being a new teacher, I wasn't yet informed of when the school had practiced lockdown drills around the year. Therefore, I had no idea if this was a drill or not. But I knew either way I had to follow protocol. I turned off the room's lights, locked the doors and windows, and had the kids sit against the walls out of sight. I'd say maybe 5 minutes passed of complete silence, when I could faintly start to hear doors being banged on down the hall. I could feel my heart start to race as the sounds got louder, as whoever was banging on the doors got closer. At this point, I still had no idea whether it was just the principal checking all the classroom locks or an actual intruder in the school. But my thoughts were interrupted by one of my students bursting out crying. It was too loud. There's no doubt whoever was outside would have been able to hear it. I could tell. The banging outside stopped in response to the noise, shortly after followed by a single pair of footsteps walking up to the door. It was silent for a few seconds, but the silence was quickly broken by a male's voice yelling out,
Hey guys, I think there's kids in this one.
and that confirmed this lockdown was real. More footsteps could be heard running up to the door, and that's when genuine attempts to break down the door were made by multiple people. At that point, not a single kid in the class wasn't crying or screaming in fear. I didn't know what to do. I was never trained for this kind of situation. And that's when 2 gunshots could be heard. But it didn't come from the intruders. Police were now inside the building. Right after the shots were fired, the intruders could be heard running down the hall. 30 minutes later, and we were given the all clear. It turns out the intruders were 3 local high school students. They were eventually caught, but when asked why they did it, they would say close to nothing. Although, one of the kids claimed it was a bet, but personally I don't believe that for a second. No bet is worth going to court over and even possibly losing your freedom. I firmly believe they had much worse intentions. Although most likely traumatized, luckily no one was physically hurt. The shots that were fired by the police were claimed to have been warning shots and were aimed directly into the ground. It's been 2 years since this all happened, and I still teach first grade at the same school and even in the same classroom. And to this day, those bullet holes can still be seen in the school's hallway. This happened back when I was in middle school. Technically, it was actually my last day in middle school. It was late May, and for our last day, our school would do a sort of field day where the whole school would play a bunch of games to celebrate the end of the school year. Now, back then, I used to be a pretty active kid, but unfortunately, due to a recent concussion, I was unable to participate in any games the whole day. I was pretty disappointed, yeah, though I did bring my DS and quickly opted to just sit inside one of the classrooms and play that, as, there wasn't really anything else I could do. None of the teachers seemed to mind, so there I was, all by myself in the classroom for my science class playing my DS, all the while the other kids got to play games in the school's gymnasium. It was a weird feeling being in that classroom alone. I don't really know how to explain it. Up until that point, I don't think I'd ever been in a classroom completely alone. Something that needs to be mentioned is that the teachers that weren't watching the kids in the gymnasium were in a room across the hall having meetings. I'd say I was playing on my DS for not even an hour when my English teacher, Miss Allen, rushed up to the classroom's door and closed it from the outside. She didn't say anything to me, so I figured she just wanted to make sure I couldn't hear whatever the teachers were talking about across the hall. Forgetting about it, I went back to playing my DS. A couple minutes later, the classroom's door swung open. I expected to see one of the teachers coming in to check on me, but no, a man I'd never seen before walked into the room and closed the door behind him. The guy had to have at least been in his 50s, and so I just assumed it was some kid's dad. It wasn't unusual for parents to come into the school to bring a student their lunch, so I asked if he was looking for someone. He replied with no, in a tone that seemed almost offended that I would even ask that question. Before I could say anything else, the guy started walking towards me. I asked him what he was doing, and that's when he lifted up his shirt, revealing a handgun on his waistband. He followed it up by saying,
Look kid, I'm gonna need you to come with me, or I'm gonna kill you.
The guy said it in the most carefree tone I had ever heard, and that along with the fact that I'd never even seen a gun in person before instantly overwhelmed me with pure fear. Before I could fully comprehend the danger of the situation I was in, the guy firmly grabbed my wrist and started pulling me towards the classroom door. But before we got into the hallway, the deafening sound of our school's lockdown alarm started going off. This was followed by the guy instantly letting go of my wrist and making a run for it down the hall and through a back exit. I stood there in shock for a second, but ultimately went back inside the classroom. I'm not sure how much time had passed when Miss Allen came back into the room and told me that she didn't want to scare me, but that there had been an intruder inside the building and a lockdown which now was over had taken place. I would tell her about the man, and instantly she brought me to a police officer who was already on the premises to explain what I had experienced. It turns out the man was the whole reason the school went into lockdown in the first place. The man was reported to have been scoping out the school all morning, and when he was seen getting close to the building itself, someone would call the police, which resulted in the lockdown. The guy was later caught and would openly admit that he had been trying to scare kids into getting into his car so he could kidnap them. And this reality still horrifies me to this day. Not a day goes by where I'm not thankful for the school's alarm going off when it did. This happened back when I was 13 years old. Back then, I had a close friend named Aiden. He was a couple years older than me, but we still got along, mainly because our houses were right next to each other. The rest of our neighborhood was mostly filled with older people, so we didn't really have anyone else to play with. Most nights we'd play random games outside until we got too tired or our parents called us in. This was before the internet was a big deal, so we did this a lot. One of the games we played the most was hide and seek, but a variation where the seeker would have to use a flashlight at all times. The big rule of the game was that the person seeking had to keep it on no matter what, and the person hiding was considered found if they got revealed by the flashlight. It made the game interesting because the hider was better able to know where the seeker was and use it to their advantage when repositioning. But the seeker could just as easily shine their huge circle of light in the hider's direction from a distance, ending the game. We typically set the boundaries to anywhere in the close parts of the neighborhood, though our neighborhood was right on the edge of a huge stretch of woods, so sometimes we'd make things interesting by making that the playing area. We never set a limit as to how far the hider could go, because typically we just genuinely didn't want to go that far, considering we played the game at night, which admittedly made for a fairly creepy setting. This one time, it was my turn to be the hider. Aiden and I had both agreed to make the woods the playing area for this round. I remember wanting to make it a challenge, so I headed out further than I usually did. Quickly, I started to regret this. It got very dark away from any house lights. By this point, I couldn't see any lights whatsoever. Considering Aiden had the only flashlight, this made traversing the woods especially difficult. All I had for light was what little was provided by the moon. After I kept walking for a while, I eventually came across an abandoned cabin. I knew this would be the perfect spot. There was no way I was going to be found in there. I stepped inside and fumbled my way around to a set of stairs. I walked up them and came across a bedroom with a single window that somewhat pointed back to my neighborhood, which by this point was way too far away to see anymore. I sat there for a long time. Nothing happened, until out of a window I saw Aiden. Only he wasn't using the flashlight, he was cheating. Clearly, he had gotten tired of the flashlight constantly revealing his position, and therefore was either covering it with his hand or had turned it off completely. I watched as his black silhouette walked closer and closer to the cabin. I began to hear leaves crunching under his footsteps as he continued forward. Eventually, he got close enough to where I could no longer see him out of the window, though I could now hear his footsteps from downstairs. Just then, out of the window, I saw the heart-dropping sight of Aiden with the flashlight walking around way off in the distance. But I could still hear footsteps from downstairs. Slowly, it hit me. Whoever was downstairs wasn't Aiden. Instinctively, I got down and hid underneath a nearby bed. To my horror, the footsteps began slowly walking up the stairs. When they got to the top, I could hear the click of a gun. My heart was pounding out of my chest by this point. A few seconds passed when I saw large boots walk into the room that in no way could have been Aiden's. They stood still near the door for what felt like an eternity before turning around and leaving the room. I took this opportunity to get out from under the bed and jump out of the window. When I landed and got to my feet, I just started running. I could hear footsteps gaining on me from behind, but I didn't look back. Eventually, Aiden saw me running at him and instantly pointed his flashlight on me, saying that he could see me and then he won the round. But when I didn't stop running, his eyes moved to behind me and the expression on his face instantly faded. He turned and began running with me towards my house. Not long after, we would reach it. We went inside and locked the door behind us. Aiden, now just as shaken up as I was, began questioning what had just happened. Disturbingly, he then asked me who the man was that was running behind me. I still remember getting goosebumps hearing him say this. I proceeded to tell him the whole story from start to finish, and he didn't question a single bit of it. We then told my parents, but did our best to downplay the situation as much as possible, making it seem like it wasn't a big deal so that they wouldn't completely freak out. They ended up calling the cops, who came out to search the cabin and the surrounding area. They searched for multiple hours, but no one was found. From then on, both of our parents didn't allow either of us to go into those woods, and I can't say this was at all disappointing. You couldn't have paid me to go back into those woods. This whole experience was extremely traumatizing, much more for me than Aiden, at least I assume. We've never been back to that cabin, and we both still can't explain who we had seen that night. A few months ago was me and my wife's second anniversary. We both agreed to take some time off of work to do something special. We live in Wyoming and decided on renting out a cabin in the snowy mountains for a few days. Yeah, it wasn't the craziest idea, but we thought it'd still be a pretty romantic getaway of sorts. Plus, the owner of the cabin was a friend of a friend and was willing to give us a discount. The cabin itself was in the middle of pretty much nowhere. In order to get to it, you had to drive down a small, removed private road. The nearest other house was probably about a mile away. These were details that we didn't exactly know before booking the place, but when we got there, the cabin was too amazing to let it bother us. It looked like it was straight off of a postcard. And in a weird way, the isolation actually made the place more comforting, what with it being surrounded by seemingly endless trees. Though, of course, this meant we didn't have any phone service. We spent the first night next to the fireplace watching a movie I had downloaded on my laptop. When it got a little later, we both decided to end off the night by going hot tubbing, as on the back porch there was a fully operational hot tub that we couldn't help but put to use. That's when I realized that I'd left my swim trunks in the back of the car parked out front. Now, something that needs to be mentioned is it had been snowing all day. Quite a bit had piled up on the ground by this point. When I walked out front, I quickly noticed a set of fresh boot prints in the snow that clearly weren't made by me or my wife. They walked out from the middle of the forest to one of the living room windows, and then right back into the same part of the forest. A couple red flags quickly stood out. At no point in the night did we hear any knocking, and the boot prints walked up to the window rather than the door. I told my wife about this, and she was a bit more unsettled by the sighting than I was. But I guess to be fair to her, we were in the middle of nowhere. This was a weird occurrence that could be cause for concern. We ultimately decided to drive into a nearby town where we had service, and message the owner to ask him if one of his friends had stopped by the cabin, or if he was expecting anyone to show up that night. We got into town and sent him a text along those lines. We waited for 30 minutes, but got no response, which I guess was fair because it was pretty late by that point. We could have called him, but again it was late, so we just decided to head back to the cabin and try and forget about it. We figured it's possible we were just blowing the whole situation out of proportion anyway. And we were planning on going into town tomorrow morning, so we figured maybe we'd get a response by then. When we got back to the cabin, neither of us were willing to sit outside in the hot tub anymore. We ended up just going to bed. We were both tired from the whole day anyway, so we quickly fell asleep. Fast forward to 3 a.m. and I woke up. But I was pretty confused as to what woke me up, because I'm typically a really deep sleeper. That's when I heard a slight bump on the bedroom window. The curtains were closed, so I couldn't see what produced the sound. I figured it must have been a piece of snow falling on the glass, so I brushed it off and tried to fall back asleep. But only a few seconds later the sound came again, this time a bit louder. I was now a little concerned, so I got up out of bed to prove to myself that it was nothing to worry about. I opened the curtains. I couldn't see anything. I turned on the flashlight on my phone to get a better look, but this left a huge glare on the window, so I had to open it in order to see anything. Right as I did, I noticed fresh boot prints in the snow right under the window. Inside, I was beginning to panic. I lifted my flashlight up and out towards the trees, following the retreating boot prints. That's when I realized they led straight to a figure just standing there in the snow, looking at me from maybe 10 yards out. I closed the window and tried to stay as calm as I could. I woke up my wife and told her that we had to leave right now. Naturally, she was confused and asked me why, but I avoided the question as I knew answering it would only further scare her. I told her to quickly pack up her things, and thankfully she complied with no further questions. A few minutes later, and we had all of our stuff at the front door packed and ready to go. I opened the door and we both sprinted towards the car. When we got in, I started it and began reversing out of the driveway when my wife screamed. My head shot back to where she was looking, and there again was the figure, this time right next to the house watching us leave. I pushed harder on the gas pedal and started speeding down the private road. Once we got cell phone service, we sent over a text to the owner of the cabin explaining the whole situation. Later that morning, we would get a text back from the guy saying that he went to the cabin to investigate, and there were indeed boot prints, but all around the building. He explained how the boot prints had stopped at every window. We didn't really know what to make of this information. Like, it was definitely terrifying, don't get me wrong, but the whole situation was basically out of our hands now. We obviously cut our whole trip short. We ended up spending the rest of our days off of work at home. We still don't know who that figure was, or what he was trying to do that night, but we're not entirely sure we even want to know the answers to these questions. As far as we know, nothing else ever happened, and nothing further came of the whole situation. There's one night in my life that I'll never forget. I was about a week away from turning 18 years old. It was a warm, late summer night. If I had to give an estimate, it was probably around 2 a.m. I was with two other friends, who I'll just refer to as Jacob and Steven. We were all hanging out in Steven's basement, doing stuff we probably shouldn't have been doing at our age. But we got bored of that pretty quickly, and decided to go outside to find something better to do. Jacob said he knew of a spot where other teenagers would often hang out. It was next to a small lake deep in a forest that we lived next to. We grabbed a few old flashlights and started walking. It took a while to get there, but when we did, we were disappointed to discover no one else was there. According to Jacob, this was a hot spot for teenagers, especially at this time of the night. But I guess we just got unlucky. Now even more bored than ever, we decided to walk around the lake to see if we could find anyone. When we got to the other side, we noticed there was an old, abandoned-looking cabin. Of course, we all wanted to explore it, so that's exactly what we started doing. I won't lie, we were making a lot of noise. Eventually, we went to the upstairs floor of the cabin, and found ourselves in a small bedroom filled with a lot of different stuff lying around, all old and covered in dust. We were all kind of sorting through the different items, when suddenly we heard the wooden door to the cabin creak open. All three of our heads shot up, looking at each other. We stood there completely still, holding our breaths. That's when we heard slight footsteps moving around downstairs. Then a man's voice.
I know you're up there.
It sounded like an older man. Just from the way he said it, I remember being genuinely fearful of my life as I stood there, still frozen. Jacob, coming to the reality of the situation, gestured us towards a small closet in the corner of the room. We shut the door as quietly as we could, and all squished together in this tiny closet. We heard footsteps climb the stairs and reach the entrance of the room.
I can hear you.
We remained dead still, not moving a muscle. The man began sifting through stuff around the room. Then, the doorknob to the closet slowly started opening. The door swung open. Steven was in the front and reacted the fastest by pushing the man to the ground. We all ran as fast as we could, out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the cabin. From there, we just kept going. We didn't stop until we reached Steven's house. We went back into his basement and took a good 5 or 10 minutes just to catch our breaths. We then tried to make sense of what we had just heard and seen. That's when Steven explained that when he shoved the man, he saw him drop a small handgun on the ground. We didn't sleep that night. We pretty much just sat there in shock the whole time. We concluded that there's no way that man lived there. The place was no doubt completely abandoned. I mean, if you saw it, you'd think the same thing. We don't know where he came from, and we don't know what he looked like, as none of us got a good enough look at him. The three of us are still good friends to this day, but ever since this experience, we've never been back to that area of the forest for obvious reasons. Even today, I still think about what would have happened if Steven didn't push the man to the ground when that closet door was opened. Spring of 2018 marked my last semester in high school. I'll be honest, it was a semester that I didn't take all that seriously. I didn't really care about my grades, and I would often skip with a couple of friends. If I remember correctly, it was a Friday when this all took place. I once again had plans to skip one of my classes. This time it was with two of my friends, who I'll call Tyler and Christian. We were all going to meet up behind the school, and from there walk to a nearby McDonald's. Now, the school typically had a few administrators and security guards outside, so to avoid them, we would walk this nature trail that went through a forest just behind the school building. We would have to walk further, but in our minds, that was better than being caught. So, we started our walk. We weren't even 5 minutes in when we came across this kid that I'd never seen before. Typically, I would see this as no big deal, writing it off as just another kid skipping. But this time I wasn't so sure. The kid was wearing jeans with a white t-shirt, both of which were extremely dirty. They were stained green and brown, the knees of his jeans especially, and his hair was full of leaves and dirt. It genuinely looked like the kid had been rolling around on the ground. As we got closer, Christian recognized him as one of the lower classmen and struck up a conversation. I quickly picked up on how out of breath and nervous the kid seemed. He kept glancing over at me and Tyler. It felt like he was almost suspicious of us. Christian eventually asked what he was doing out here and why his clothes were so dirty. He responded saying he was skipping, but like the whole school day. This didn't exactly explain why he was so dirty, but okay. Tyler jumped in, jokingly stating how it looked like he'd been camping out here. All of us started laughing. Well, all of us except for the kid. He just stood there, now with an almost angry look on his face. He then started looking around, before looking back at us and saying,
Hey, do you guys want to see something?
We all sort of hesitantly agreed. That's when the kid lifted his shirt to reveal a handgun tucked under his waistband. All of us instinctively took a couple steps back. At this point, I really felt in danger. This was the first time in my life I'd seen a real gun in person. That's when Christian spoke up.
Dude, what are you doing? Where'd you get that?
The kid pointed down the trail behind him, explaining that he found it. Christian said he probably should just ditch it and get out of here. I was not at all expecting what the kid said next.
I don't think you guys understand. I'm about to be in a lot of trouble.
Something about the way he said it was extremely unsettling. Me, Christian, and Tyler all looked at each other. They didn't have to say anything. I knew exactly what we were about to do. Without warning, the three of us turned and ran as fast as we could off the trail and into the forest. We ran through dense trees for a good 5 minutes until we reached the school parking lot. I will never forget the sight we were met with. There were police cars everywhere. We were sweating, out of breath, and terrified. None of us knew what was going on, so in the midst of the chaos, the three of us literally just each ran home. Later, we would get more information on what actually happened. Apparently, the kid was a freshman and actually had been skipping the whole day. It turns out he stole the gun from a parked car in a nearby parking lot. He then made a post online threatening the school. I don't know exactly what platform it was posted to. I never saw it myself, but from what I've heard, the post was pretty graphic and disturbing. Some students of the school would see the post and report it to faculty. From there, the school instantly went into lockdown. Police would be informed of the threats, and that's how so many of them showed up in the parking lot so quick. The kid would later be spotted exiting the nature trail and walking towards the school. From there, he would be arrested. A lot of people say the kid hadn't been taking his medication for a week or so, and that's what caused him to do what he did. But I honestly don't know. These could just be rumors. Me, Tyler, and Christian would not inform anyone that we came into contact with the kid. We all agreed that we did not want to get roped up in all of this. Looking back, based on what I now know about the kid and the threats he made, we were all in serious danger. At the same time though, a part of me feels like we stalled the kid. Had we not slowed him down, and who knows if the school could have responded quick enough. But still, this experience is one that I wish I would not have had to go through. This took place back when I was in high school. One of my good friends and I were involved in a school production at the time. There was a lot that needed to be set up, so we volunteered to work one of the night shifts to help out. We didn't have to, but the school had given the job to an older janitor, and we knew he'd appreciate the help. The school day had long been done, and it was now about 8 p.m. Me, my friend, and the janitor were working away, setting up inside the school auditorium. Eventually, my friend and I had to use the bathroom, so we exited the auditorium and started walking down the hall. Now, this hall was sort of sectioned off from the rest of the school. It never saw much use, even during the school day. Usually, the only time I'd find myself using it is to go to this specific bathroom. Anyway, the hall contains a door to a utility closet that contains the school's security camera monitors and just other general cleaning supplies. But like the hall itself, the closet saw almost no use. Yes, the school had multiple security cameras around the building, but they were never used. They were more so just for show. That being the case, the door was always left locked. But as we walked down the hallway, we noticed it was slightly open. Not enough for us to see inside, but enough for us to notice it. I mention all of this because as we passed the door and started getting closer to the bathroom, I noticed one of the school cameras on the ceiling was on. I could clearly see a small red light blinking. More disturbingly, I noticed it was just slightly moving with us as we walked, like in a way where the lens would always be facing us. When we got to the bathroom, I told my friend about it. She hadn't noticed it, but she agreed it was creepy. Needless to say, we were a bit freaked out at this point. As far as I knew, me, my friend, and the one janitor were the only ones in the building. We agreed to take a different way back to the auditorium. When we got there, we told the janitor what had happened. I was hoping he would say something like how there was another janitor that came in during the night to man the cameras for whatever reason, or some other reasonable explanation. But no. As we told him, I could see his face grow into a genuine look of concern. He said we should probably go check it out. Definitely the last thing I wanted him to say. But we agreed. We didn't really feel good about letting him go alone, so the three of us started making our way over there. As we got closer to the door, we noticed it was now completely closed. And when we got up to it and tried the door handle, we realized it was locked. The janitor knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He did have a key, but now seeing for himself that the cameras in the hallway were actually on and in use, he instead opted to call the police. We went back to the auditorium and waited for maybe 10 minutes until 2 officers arrived. The janitor would show them to the closet, while my friend and I continued to wait in the auditorium. Only about a minute passed, when down the hallway we could hear the horrific sound of yelling, followed by gunshots. This was the first time I had ever genuinely felt like my life was in danger. The both of us were frozen in fear. Neither of us knew what to do, so we did nothing. We continued to sit there, just listening. A few seconds went by, when we heard footsteps running in our direction. To our relief, it was the janitor. He told us that everything was fine, but that we needed to leave right away. We tried to get more details from him, but he wouldn't tell us anything. He escorted us to a back exit, and from there we got in our cars and each drove home. I was terrified. The whole situation felt surreal, almost like a dream. I had no idea what to make of everything. But later I would get the whole story. As it turns out, a man in his late 40s had actually been living in the closet. When police arrived and opened the door, they would find him sitting in the corner holding a firearm. They of course had to defend themselves, so shots were fired. There were no life-threatening injuries, but the man in the closet did get hit. He would then be detained as police waited for an ambulance. I guess somehow the man was able to get a key to the closet, and from the looks of it, he would spend pretty much all day and night in there. Because he had access to the cameras, this meant he could see everything that was going on in the school, even during school hours. And like I mentioned, the janitors don't really use that closet, allowing the man to go undetected for so long. How long exactly, I'm not entirely sure. I honestly don't really like to think about it. As far as I know, the police never got the guy's motives. It's possible he was just homeless and looking for a place to live, but it's also possible he had worse intentions. I mean, the guy did have a gun. But again, I don't really like to think about it. I never looked at my high school the same after that night. Fortunately, I moved and changed schools the next year. This happened a few years ago now. I was in high school at the time. I don't remember what grade, but that's not really important. It happened on a day sometime near the end of the semester. A few friends and I had plans to ditch class to play basketball outside. Close to our school's building was a full basketball court right on the edge of a forest. I still don't know if the school actually owned the court, but regardless, we would spend a lot of time over there. People could totally see us on the court and not in class, but you'd be surprised with how many people just didn't care. I think I got in trouble a total of like 1 time. If I remember correctly, there were 4 of us. We were playing 2-on-2. We had just started when a group of what had to have been 4 or 5 college kids started walking up to us. They got right near us, and then seemed surprised and started apologizing, saying how they thought we were someone else. We said it was fine. It was kind of weird though. I mean, I don't think my friends even noticed them until they said that. They then proceeded to walk directly into the forest. This was also a little strange, but they weren't threatening or anything, so we ignored it, continuing our game. This was when things took a sharp turn. What had to have been the second our game ended, all of our heads shot towards the forest. The most horrible, blood-curdling scream rang out. A couple of us, me included, ran just slightly into the forest to see if we could see what was happening. Clear as day, there were 2 giant dudes in ski masks jumping a couple of the college kids that we were just talking to, but with baseball bats. That's when one of the guys abruptly looked up at us. My heart sank. Out of fear, all of us ran back inside. I really do hate to admit it, but we didn't do anything about it. Rather, we all went back to our respective classes, giving all the excuses necessary to avoid suspicion. I still don't know how, but somehow the school must have found out about the whole situation, as the next thing we knew, the school was going into a real lockdown. Fortunately, nothing would come of the lockdown, but over the next couple of days, word would start to spread about what actually happened. Apparently, it was a drug deal gone wrong. A few of the college kids were actually sent to the hospital with pretty serious injuries. But seeing what I saw that day, this fact doesn't really surprise me. As for the guys in the ski masks, they were never caught or even identified. Even today, I still think about how that could have been us. We could have easily been misidentified as the college kids, and been even more easily jumped. I still can't get the image of that guy in a ski mask, looking up and making direct eye contact with us out of my head. For the rest of the semester, this whole situation was pretty much everything anyone talked about. In November of 2013, a Reddit account that's since been deleted made a post on the Let's Not Meet subreddit. r/Let's Not Meet is a subreddit where people share actual true scary encounters they've experienced. The poster explains how he had just found the subreddit and wanted to post an experience of his own. He lived in Brisbane, Australia at the time. He recalls how his dad had just purchased Foxtel, which was cable TV in Australia. Only the TV in the lounge room could use the cable box, but the poster really wanted to use it in his room downstairs. He didn't want to buy a second cable box, so he instead opted to buy an AV transmitter, a much cheaper option. An AV transmitter was basically a 2-part piece of hardware. One piece would connect to the cable box upstairs in the lounge room, and the other would connect to the TV back downstairs. It would then transmit a wireless signal. This would allow him to receive a video signal to his TV downstairs. The first image in the post shows the TV in the room on the dresser. The poster goes on to explain how he and his sister were the only ones home when he decided he wanted to try and set it up. He connected the AV transmitter to the cable box upstairs and to his TV downstairs, but it wasn't working. He tried changing the channel, switching around the cables, nothing was working. That's when he remembered that the cable box upstairs wasn't even plugged in, so obviously it wasn't going to work. But the screen then started fuzzing in. After a while, a bedroom could be seen on the TV. Immediately, he pulled out his phone and took a picture. At first, he thought it was his bedroom, so he ran out. He went upstairs to tell his sister. They later went back down. The TV was still getting a signal, but they had no idea how. The AV receiver plugged in was somehow receiving a live feed. They were able to confirm that it wasn't the poster's bedroom, or any bedroom in the house. They waited until their parents got home, and when they did, they told them about it. All of them went down to the TV. This time, there was a man in the bedroom. The poster took another picture. He then explained how his dad recognized the man as one of their neighbors. Somehow the AV transmitter was receiving their neighbor's camera feed. None of them really knew what to do. This went on for a week, and they started feeling kind of weird having access to this. The poster went on to explain how their neighbors had been having renovations done to their house. Workers would be at the place pretty much all day. They again tried turning on the TV to fix the signal. It was still showing their neighbor's bedroom, but this time they saw their neighbor's plumber. Eventually he went right up to the camera and looked directly down the lens. He started messing with it before putting it back. The poster's dad told their neighbor about the camera, but they had no idea what he was talking about. He convinced them to let him go up to the room to try and find the camera. Hidden in the wall, he did find it. They immediately called the police. The poster didn't hear anything more for the next week, but they eventually asked their neighbors whatever came of the situation. Apparently, the police camped out by the house each night and found that one car in particular would always park right next to it at the same time. A man inside would pull up his laptop, but not get out of the car. He would drive off before the sun came up. The man was discovered to be the plumber, the man who planted the camera. That's where the post ends. In a reply comment, the poster confirmed the man was arrested, but he doesn't mention what he all got charged with. This post was a reply comment in an Ask Reddit thread. The original question read, "What is the creepiest thing that has ever actually happened to you?" One of the top comments is a guy who recalls a set of disturbing experiences he had throughout his life. He says they're 100% true, and even shares a video he took as supporting evidence. He starts by sharing an experience he had when he was 8 years old. It was 11 p.m. and he was walking his dog with his mom out in his neighborhood, which was in Lansing, Michigan. He said it was quiet that night, but all of a sudden he could hear this whistling sound coming from a nearby swamp. His mom heard it too. He said at first it sounded like a bird, but the whistle had a more human-like tone and wasn't really consistent, making him think it was a person. He remembers his mom looking very concerned and immediately changing directions back towards the house. That was the first experience. The second happened 2 years later. He was again taking his dog for a walk out late at night, but this time alone. He heard the whistling again, and immediately remembered how he felt the first time he heard it 2 years ago. He sprinted back to the house. Nothing would happen for years after that. He was now 24 and had moved away from Michigan to South Dakota. For the 4th of July, he and his girlfriend decided to sit along the bank of the Missouri River at a somewhat popular spot to watch fireworks from a distance. Most of the other people had moved upriver to get a better view, leaving them pretty much alone. That's when he once again heard whistling, reminding him of the 2 experiences he had years ago now when he was a kid. This time he pulled out his phone and started recording. It picked up the whistling. He attached the recording to his reply comment.
You whistling? Is it you?
He questions his girlfriend, hoping that this time it was just her, but it wasn't her. The whistling continues, until eventually the 2 of them hear slight paddling out in the water. He turns the camera, and in the darkness you can just barely make out a man in a canoe slowly paddling towards them. That's where the video ends, but he did say that when the man got close enough to the shore, he stood up and yelled out, "Who are you?" To this, the man then simply turned around and started slowly paddling back towards the way he came without saying a word. That was the last time he ever heard the whistling. He still doesn't know what to make of it. To think somebody would have stalked him all those years from Michigan to South Dakota doesn't exactly seem the most likely, but it's still possible. He basically ends the reply comment with many unanswered questions, like who was the guy in the canoe? And was it the same guy he heard whistling when he was a kid? What does the guy want from him? He doesn't know the answers to these questions, but he says that he still worries that he might sometime hear the whistling again. I wanted to take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Established Titles. Established Titles is a project based around an old historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lords or ladies. They allow you to buy as little as 1 square foot of dedicated land in Edelston, Scotland, to which you'll then be sent a certificate officially giving you your title. And it's not like some fake certificate either. You can officially change your plane ticket or even credit card to include Lord or Lady before your name. Your certificate will contain a unique plot number which lets you see the exact location of your land at any time. So, for example, this is exactly where on the earth my 1 square foot of land is located. The coolest part about Established Titles is that for every plot of land that's sold, they work with global charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to help support global reforestation efforts. It makes for an amazing last-minute gift while helping to preserve the woodlands of Scotland. Established Titles is running a massive sale right now. Plus, if you use the code CHILLING10, you can get an additional 10% off. The first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot, like within a few minutes of walking. So go to establishedtitles.com/chilling10 or use the link in the description to get your own title. Roommate wanted, female only. This was the title of a Reddit post uploaded almost 10 years ago now. It refers to the title of a Craigslist ad a girl named Amanda had seen while looking for a place to rent. The post consists of her detailed experience. Amanda was browsing the internet when she came across the ad. The listing was for a room in a house for $225 a month, which was pretty cheap for the area. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student who wasn't comfortable living with any males. Amanda would get her own room and bathroom. The only thing was the Craigslist ad only had one picture. It was a picture of the outside of the house. There were no pictures of the inside. But still interested, Amanda sent an email to the occupant. In less than an hour, she got an email back with all the details and the time to stop by. The time said 8 p.m., past when it would have gotten dark. In the email, the occupant said this was because she worked late. So, that night at 8 p.m., Amanda arrived at the house. She walked up to the front door and was met by a handwritten note that said, "Door broken, use back door." She started walking around towards the back, and as she did, she noticed how unkempt the place looked. The windows were covered in dust, and the grass was way overgrown. She knocked on the back door. An older man opened it. At first, she thought she was at the wrong house, but the guy went on to explain how he was the landlord, and that the occupant asked him to show her around. The post described him as clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and a guy who looked like he lived in his car. A bit hesitant, Amanda stepped inside and allowed the man to give her a tour. Immediately, she noticed the place had no furniture whatsoever. There was only one light on, the light in the kitchen. The landlord would answer questions, but was irritable to keeping lights on for too long. He rushed her around, only letting her look in rooms for a few seconds. They eventually got to one room that the landlord wouldn't open. He said it was the occupant's room and that she wouldn't want them to go in there. As they were heading back to the living room, Amanda noticed a plank nailed across the front door. She tried to get out of there, thanking the owner for the tour and heading back towards the back door. That's when the man perked up and mentioned how he forgot to show her the basement. He explained how it was just recently furnished and would make for a great rec room. He was standing between her and the back door. She felt like she had no other choice. He opened the basement door, saying, "Ladies first," as he motioned her downstairs. Just then, an unrelated car parked outside on the street. At the exact same time, Amanda received a text on her phone. She pretended it was a call and faked a conversation about her friend being outside waiting to pick her up. She quickly excused herself, leaving the back door and now full-on sprinting to her car. When she got home, she called the cops. She tried going back to the Craigslist ad, but it was deleted. It turns out the house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier. The property was completely abandoned. There was never any real occupant or any real room to rent. The room the man didn't want to show her on the tour turned out to be the room he lived in. But the worst part was the basement. Police found a piece of fishing line at shin level strewn across the stairs about halfway down. There was no furniture down there as the man had said. There was nothing but a pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with rolls of duct tape. The poster never mentioned if the man was caught or not. In 2014, Jenny, a single mother, would make a post on Reddit titled "Experience Using Sleep as Android App." Sleep as Android is an app that's supposed to help you improve your sleeping habits. It's basically a more advanced alarm. It will track your sleep cycles and wake you up at the most beneficial time. One of the features of the app is that it records audio during the night. In the post, Jenny explains how she'd had the app for a few months. She would sometimes review the audio, but all she ever heard was herself coughing, moving around in bed, stuff like that. That was until one night, when at 2:04 a.m., the app caught something different. Jenny was going through the recordings to delete them when she found it. She posted the audio along with the Reddit post.
Oh, what are you doing? Okay. Okay.
Clearly, a male voice can be heard responding to Jenny's sleep talking. She says, "What are you doing?" To which another voice quickly replies, "Nothing." Some clicking sounds then start up before the voice speaks again, although it's not clear what's said this time. The only two people in the room that night were Jenny and her 3-year-old. But the voice that's talking sounds much deeper, something that neither Jenny or her 3-year-old could have replicated. One Redditor took it so far as to test this. In a post titled, "The voice in the famous sleep app recording is not the woman talking to herself," he gives proof to prove his point. He basically goes into detail about how the human voice works, and that the pitch of the voice in the audio clip couldn't have been replicated by the woman. Her voice was just too high. He even reached out to her and got further samples of her voice to confirm this. This led many to believe that she was the victim of a home invasion, and that someone was in the process of searching her bedroom for things to steal. But to this day, we still don't know. The man in the audio clip was never identified. The original poster has since moved to a different house. In 2012, an Ask Reddit thread was posted with the title, "What is the creepiest true story someone has ever told you?" A comment that has since been deleted by the user recounts an experience her parents had told her, where they had unknowingly encountered the serial killer Ted Bundy on their first date. It was around the time in the day where the two would have said goodnight, when the male in the situation suggested they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon in Utah. He was familiar with the place and didn't want the date to end, so he figured it was a good idea. She agreed, so they drove up to the mouth of the canyon, got out, and started hiking with only the light provided by the moon. The two started getting a bad feeling when they came up to a section of path under some trees, which had no access to light. The path was almost pitch black, but they continued on. As they kept walking, the man felt his foot hit something soft directly in the middle of the path. It was too dark to see anything. Instead of inspecting it, the both of them agreed to turn around and run back to the car. They soon forgot about it, until many years later, after being married for some time, when they were watching an interview with Ted Bundy around the time he had been captured. The interviewer asked him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught. Ted Bundy proceeded to explain the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and took her life. He said that shortly after, he heard a couple walking up the trail and managed to hide in the trees just before they would have been able to see him. A man then walked directly into the woman's body, but for some reason just turned around and walked away. That night, the poster's father had walked directly into a corpse without even realizing it. The serial killer Ted Bundy was only feet away from him, and he had no idea. That was where the reply comment ended. When I was as young as 14, I started working at various gas stations in my town. My town was small, Everyone knew pretty much everyone, so the owners wouldn't care if I came in and helped out with stuff like mopping the floors, stocking the coolers, or even running the register at times, all for a small amount of cash. This all took place back in the early 90s in Florida. It was maybe 11 p.m. at night, and I was sitting at my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows of the gas station. I would generally spend most of the nights at that table reading books and periodically getting up to do different chores. Now, being only 14, I obviously wasn't allowed to be the only one running the store at any given time. It would usually be me and a manager, or maybe another employee or two. This night, it was me and a guy named Jeff. Jeff was one of the part-time managers, and usually when it was only me and him, he would spend most of his time in the back, which basically left me to hold down the store by myself. This night was no different. I remember sitting at the register when I glanced up. Something had caught my attention that was especially odd. I could see a lady who was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. Like, there were literally no customer cars in the parking lot. Now, this in itself was weird, as because of where we were located, we would get almost nobody that would walk here, especially not from the direction of the interstate. I mean, the store was practically in the middle of nowhere along a very desolate interstate. Nobody just walks this road. I figured she must have broken down somewhere and was coming up to fill a gas container or use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. After around a minute of me watching her, I realized she didn't have a container in her hands. She then came into the store and looked around for a few minutes. The whole situation just felt off. I remember getting a strange and disturbing vibe from her, just from the way she was looking around the store. By this point, Jeff had come out from the back and was standing behind the register with me. He would occasionally do this when customers came in. The lady then walked up to the counter and started telling us a story about how her car had broken down and that she needed a ride to some town I had never heard of before. Jeff promptly responded, saying that he was working and that there was no way he could take her, as he was the manager and couldn't leave me here alone. That's when the lady turned to look at me, as if to get my response. Before saying anything, I looked back at Jeff, who looked at me with a very cold and hard stare, subtly shaking his head as if to say no. And that was my assurance that I knew that he knew something was off about this lady. Now, before I could respond, she turned back to Jeff and pointed at me, asking if I could take her. Jeff quickly and sternly responded that I was too young to drive and said there was no way we could help her. I obviously didn't argue with Jeff about his response on my behalf, as to be quite honest, this was completely out of character for him. Jeff was normally friendly and even chatty with the customers, and this further supported the fact that Jeff knew something was off about this lady. The lady, now clearly infuriated, cussed us out and left. As she walked back down the parking lot, I kept an eye on her. I noticed she had stopped at the end of the parking lot, right next to the interstate itself. I also noticed she was now on a phone call and waited for maybe 2 minutes when a car pulled up, stopped right next to her, and let her in as if the car was expecting her. The whole situation was weird, yeah, but I never truly realized how much danger I was actually in that night until a while later. Almost a year passed. It was night, and I was in my bedroom falling asleep as the TV was on in the background. I don't know what channel it was on, possibly some news channel or something, but regardless, something I heard on the TV snapped me wide awake. I sat up to look at the TV, and was greeted with the mugshot of a lady on the screen. As soon as I saw her, I immediately knew. That was the same lady that I had been in the store with almost a year prior, and who tried to lure either me or my manager to drive her into town. I was 100% sure that was the same woman. It turns out the lady was Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer with a confirmed 7 victims, who were all men. Eileen would lure her victims out into the middle of nowhere, and that's where she would shoot them at point-blank range. What disturbs me most is how close I was to becoming one of those victims myself. From both the way she acted in the store and what I now know about her, I firmly believe her plans were to kill either me or my manager Jeff that night. To this day, I still have nightmares about what would have happened had we done what she said. This happened to me and my wife back in the summer of 2017. We had actually only gotten married a few months prior, and obviously because of the wedding costs, our financial situation wasn't the best. and this made it so that we could only afford a place to live that was super cheap and that would let us pay week to week. But luckily, we were able to find just that in the form of a boarding house in our city. The house was 3 stories and had 4 rooms, with a shared kitchen and a bathroom for everyone. We moved into one of the rooms on the 2nd floor. Now, obviously with it being a boarding house, we had to share with a few other people. The most noteworthy ones being a young couple named Jim and Jennifer just above us in a room on the 3rd floor. And in the 3 months we lived there, they were the only neighbors we talked to. They seemed similar to us in both age and interests, but we usually just talked to them in passing, or even sometimes on the front porch, where we were all out having a cigarette. Though, after a few weeks, we would quickly realize that they didn't get along too well. It started off with small things, like hearing them yell at each other for short durations of time, or hearing one of them angrily leave the house in some absurd hour of the night. But the short fights didn't last long. They would get only longer and louder as time went on. Though, that was until one day. My wife and I were watching a movie, and the whole time the usual fights were taking place just above us. But right as the movie ended, we both noticed they abruptly stopped. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to finally have peace and quiet, but it was completely out of character for them. I mean, this never happened. They would almost never just abruptly stop yelling at each other, especially at this point in the night. Though, even still, we both agreed that we should take advantage of the silence and try to go to sleep. And luckily we were able to. But just for me to be woken up in the middle of the night by my wife, who was shaking me and looking off toward the side of our bed. I was tired and completely out of it. I didn't know what time it was, or why I was being woken up. Out of habit, I turned over to get up. But when I did, I could make out a man standing right next to our bed, hunched over my nightstand going through the drawer. I was in absolute disbelief. After locking eyes, he stood up from his hunch position and proceeded to just stare at me. I sat up on my bed, and the guy started backing up slowly. I honestly didn't know if what I was seeing was real or just my imagination. But after turning on our room's lamp, I realized it was our upstairs neighbor Jim. The same one who was always yelling and keeping us up late. I was a little relieved, but still, why was he going through our stuff while we were sleeping? It was completely out of character for him. After calming down for a second, I said,
What's up, Jim? What are you doing in our room, man?
After a few seconds of silence, Jim responded by asking if he could borrow our car, or if we could take him somewhere. My wife, who was now fully awake, screamed at him no. Not after he broke into her room at 3 in the morning. She told him that if he didn't leave, she was going to call the cops. And Jim responded to this by full-on sprinting out of the room. But not just the room. The dude full-on ran out the front door and down the street in a seemingly random direction. I looked at my wife, and we both agreed that something was clearly off about the whole situation. We figured at this point we had to go upstairs and check on Jim's wife Jennifer. And so we do. We go upstairs, and the first thing we notice is the door to the room was shut, but it wasn't locked. I told my wife we should probably just leave her alone, but she insisted against it. So I reluctantly knocked and shouted the usual hello. After no response, we slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. What we saw next was straight out of a horror movie. The room looked terrible, as if someone had just gone crazy hitting random areas with an axe. That's when we noticed Jennifer lying on the floor face down. We walked over to her, thinking that Jim had knocked her unconscious. But as we got closer, we realized there was fresh blood staining the carpet underneath her. In complete horror, we called the cops immediately. We explained to them that we believed we had just walked into a murder scene, but that the murderer himself had already left. The police would tell us to leave the room and wait outside until they arrived. And sure enough, they would arrive not even 5 minutes later. After explaining everything that happened that night, the cops set out a search for Jim. And luckily, they were able to find him around an hour later, still running down the street. After further talking with the cops, they said it looked like Jim was trying to find a gas station so that he could get fuel to help him burn the whole house down, with the goal of burning Jennifer's dead body inside. This in turn would remove all evidence connecting him to the murder, though Jim would ultimately be convicted with the murder of his own wife. For the next couple of days, both me and my wife couldn't leave the house, as every time we tried, we would be swarmed by different news reporters asking us for an interview. Me and my wife would of course move out as soon as we found the funds to do so, but still, the whole thing was insanely terrifying. I mean, in the middle of the night, we had unknowingly come face to face with a man who had just murdered his own wife, and who was ultimately planning to murder us in the process of destroying the evidence. This happened 2 years ago, when I was working for a very large carpet cleaning company. It's exactly what you'd expect. I'd spend the whole workday going from house to house, completely deep cleaning the residents' carpets with a lot of different tools and machinery. I was 22 and a female. I'm actually pretty sure I was one of the only females working for this company, but at the same time I really enjoyed it, and if I'm being honest, I was actually really good at the job. So, because of this, I was given a lot of work, and would usually hit between 6 to 8 houses daily, driving all across multiple towns. This night, I was working late, as one of the houses I cleaned earlier in the day took way longer than expected, which of course sent me back the rest of the day. I'd say it was around 7 PM when I had one house left to do for the day. Though, upon arrival at the given address, I quickly realized it was in the middle of nowhere. And after knocking on the front door, I also realized no one was home. I was annoyed, yeah, but realistically I was the one that was late for the appointment. I decided to wait until someone came home, as I knew I'd get chewed out by my boss if I left without cleaning anything. And luckily, 10 minutes later, the resident pulled up next to my van. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing dirty shorts and a jacket. He honestly seemed a bit awkward, but was apologetic and let me into his house with all my needed equipment. Upon entering, I instantly realized the carpet and just the house in general was already unbelievably clean. I mean, it even smelled like cleaning supplies had just been used. To be honest, it was a little weird. I wasn't used to seeing already clean carpets upon arrival. I was genuinely questioning whether me cleaning them would even make a difference. But regardless, I followed protocol and pulled out my company laptop to calculate how much it was going to cost before starting.
Hey, do they keep track of where you are on that thing?
His question caught me off guard. That was an immediate red flag. After the initial shock from the question, I replied saying that it did, and that my boss knew exactly how long each job should take. In reality, this was a complete lie. The laptop was literally just used to run a program that can calculate how much to charge a customer based on the inputted amount of work. But I felt like I had to lie, as there was definitely something off about this guy. Regardless, I started cleaning. I just figured the quicker I could clean these carpets, and the quicker I could get out of here and call it a day. Fast forward around an hour later, and I was finished. I hastily met up with the guy to explain I was done, and how much he owed me. But before I could, he interrupted me. He asked me if I could also clean his basement carpets, as he forgot to list them when he ordered the service. My heart literally dropped. I just wanted to be done with this and get out of here. But my stupid customer service conditioned brain couldn't figure out how to get away with saying no. The guy led me to his basement door, opened it, and gave me a hand signal as if to gesture that I was to go down first. I hesitated, but ultimately I did. Once I got to the bottom, I was horrified. The basement looked horrible compared to the rest of the house. Not only was it unfinished with no carpet whatsoever, but there were clearly 7 deep freezers lining the walls. In the middle of the room was a lit, low-hanging ceiling light revealing an old television set, VHS tapes scattered all over the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind the set were 2 white shelves full of VHS tapes. The whole while I'm looking at the basement, the guy stood at the top of the steps blocking the doorway with a disturbing smile on his face. I looked up at him and said,
Yeah man, let me go get my stuff.
With absolutely no intention of cleaning anything, I just wanted to get out of there. I held my breath and began to walk back up the stairs. The whole while, all I could hear was my own heartbeat in my ears. But as I got to about the 3rd stair from the top, the guy was still blocking the door, with still that disturbing smile on his face. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, just looking at the guy, waiting for him to get out of the way, when I swear I could hear footsteps in the basement behind me. Out of pure instinct and adrenaline, without even looking back, I charged towards the guy in front of me. Luckily, I was able to break past him, and right as I did, I beelined it out of the front door and into my van parked outside. I was leaving thousands of dollars of cleaning equipment behind. But honestly, in that moment, I didn't care. I legitimately felt like my life was in danger. As I was pulling away, I glanced back at the house one last time, and I saw the same man looking out one of the windows, now with no smile on his face, but rather a cold, hard stare. I thought I could see another person, but I honestly don't know. The whole memory is sort of just a blur. The truth of the matter is that my boss would not have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't show up for my shift the next day. The next morning, I would call my boss, tell him everything, and ultimately quit that very day. As far as I know, they got the police involved, but I tried to distance myself from the whole situation, so I really don't know what ended up happening. I suffered PTSD over this experience. That day still haunts me, and to this day, I can't explain what I found in that basement or the sounds of footsteps I thought to have heard behind me. But one thing's for certain. I believe that man, and whoever else was there, had planned to kill me that night for some sick reason or another. This encounter happened back in 2007 when I was 20 years old. I'm a female, and I didn't get my driver's license until January of that year. So now being able to drive myself opened a lot of doors for me. And because of that, I took a lot of solo road trips to my friend's house that was a couple states over. I remember one time specifically, I was driving alone on an interstate on a random day in July on my way to visit my friend for a long weekend. Her parents were away, and we had the house to ourselves and were planning on drinking, hot tubbing, and to overall just have a good time. It was a Friday, and I had left a lot later than I wanted to. Like, it was dark at this point, and being a new driver, driving in the dark made me pretty uneasy. After a few hours, I stopped at a gas station to fill up and get some snacks for the last part of my drive. I was heading into the store when a man, maybe in his early 40s, approached me. He was only around 5 feet tall and had on a plain black tee and jeans with dark brown hair. I noticed he had come out of a black pickup truck and only moments ago parked a few spaces away from my car. The guy had a super intense stare that immediately creeped me out. As he caught up to me, he tried starting a conversation by asking if I was from the area, where I was headed, and if I knew of anything fun to do. I quickly replied with no, shaking him off as just another creepy dude. Though, surprisingly, he then invited me to go play mini golf or catch a movie with him. Without even looking at him, I declined his invitation and continued towards the store. Quite honestly, I was shocked he asked me to do something with him. The whole vibe was off. It was pretty uncomfortable and just random. As I was entering the store, I could then hear him yell a stern "hey." It was super aggressive and uncalled for, that it even startled a family walking out of the store. Though I just ignored it and continued inside. Shortly after, I could tell the guy followed me. He was clearly staring at me, so I went to use the bathroom and stayed in the stall for at least 10 minutes texting my friend about the guy. Thankfully, when I came out, I couldn't see him in the store anymore. I then went out to put gas in my car, and was again relieved as his black pickup was nowhere to be seen. Though, to my absolute horror, as I was pulling out of the gas station parking lot, I could hear someone persistently honking their horn. I looked in my rearview mirror and I could clearly see the same black pickup behind me. The guy was now shouting and signaling me to pull over to the side. I of course freaked out, stepped on it and pulled onto the on-ramp back onto the highway. But the guy was following me. I called my friend, extremely terrified. I drove really fast, and looking back, I'm lucky I didn't get into an accident. The guy didn't follow me for that long, and I think only after a few exits he was gone. Though, even still, the last hours of my drive were extremely tense. I didn't stop for the rest of the trip, and never saw the guy's car again. I remember checking my mirrors constantly the rest of the way. Eventually, I got to my friend's house safely, and we actually had a nice weekend despite the encounter. The whole thing was definitely creepy, but over the years I didn't think too much about it. That was until around 6 years later, when the memory would once again come fresh in my mind. I was talking with another friend of mine who was big into serial killer documentaries and things like that. I remember at one point I had mentioned my encounter, jokingly suggesting that the man I had met was a serial killer, and explained to her my experience. She was fascinated, and therefore wanted to Google active serial killers in the area of where I experienced it all. But the first guy that came up made my heart drop. It was a man named Adam Leroy Lane. I instantly recognized the guy. There was no doubt in my mind, that was the same guy I had encountered at the gas station that night. Both the time and the area were a match. The man had 3 convictions. It was 2 counts of murder and 1 count of assault. This discovery has haunted me ever since, and caused me to be much more cautious in public at night. My heart goes out to the victims of this man and their families. I've been grateful every day since that I didn't become one of them. When I was in my early 20s and fresh out of college, I lived in some pretty sketchy, albeit cheap apartment buildings in the US. Now, something to note is that the walls in my apartment block out almost no sound. And because of this, I would almost always hear my neighbor to the left of me blasting his music. Though, if I'm being honest, it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. I would just simply play my own music to not hear it as loud. One night, I could tell he had been drinking a lot, simply from the way I could hear him stumbling across his room. I also figured his girlfriend must have been there, as I could hear him practically yelling at her, which unfortunately wasn't all that uncommon. Usually when things get that loud, I try to get away from it all, and seeing as it wasn't that late, I decided to head out for the night with some friends. We went to a few clubs, and overall had a good time. Fast forward to around 1 AM or so, and my friends were dropping me back off at my apartment. Though, as we were driving into the parking lot, in the distance we could see my neighbor outside crouched down in between some cars and the apartment building. Okay, kinda weird, but I figured it was whatever, as the guy was just generally creepy anyway. My friends were clearly more weirded out than I was. I honestly didn't think much of it, and just had them drop me off near the gate entrance, as it would be easier for them to leave the parking lot that way. But as I was walking toward my apartment building, I swear my heart dropped. I noticed my neighbor was now standing perfectly still in one of the bushes that was between 2 of the apartment buildings. As I got closer, it was clear he thought I didn't see him. To break the tension, I waved at him and mumbled a greeting, as I wasn't just going to pretend that I couldn't see him. After doing so, he stepped out of the bush and came into the dim streetlight, not saying a word, but rather just staring at me. Never in my life have I looked into eyes so widened and fully dilated. The whole encounter was disturbing to say the least, but I tried to ignore it and continued into the building. Right as I got to my apartment door, I got inside and went straight to bed. I was exhausted and just wanted to forget everything and go to sleep. Although, all through the night, I could hear thumps and rustling that sounded like furniture moving. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of cops outside banging on my neighbor's door.
New York City Police Department!
I was partially relieved to hear them, but that quickly turned to fear of why they were there in the first place. I could hear them take him away in handcuffs, and shortly after the police started knocking on my door. They asked me when the last time I had talked to or seen him was, and without hesitation, I told the officer everything that had happened the other night. The yelling, the noises, the encounter in the parking lot, and even the rustling sounds all night. But what I was told next will forever haunt me. I was told that my neighbor had brutally murdered his girlfriend that night. They said he dragged her body outside and into a nearby ditch behind the apartment buildings. And that's when I realized that the other night I was looking at a person who had just taken another human being's life. I honestly felt terrible for the woman. To this day, what disturbs me most is how close I was to death, quite literally, and how he could have ambushed me out of insanity, since he was just waiting in the darkness when I walked up. I moved into a different apartment in a better part of town shortly after the occurrence. I'm a female and 22 years old. I just recently got out of a pretty abusive relationship, and honestly, I wasn't in the best place mentally because of it. If I'm being real, it was difficult for me to now have to go home each night to an empty apartment with just myself. Anyways, this night my friends had decided to take me to a hockey game to get me out of the house and potentially get my mind off of the breakup. It was a Friday night, and we had been consuming a decent amount of alcohol during the progression of the game. In the arena we were attending, there was this bar where you could buy as many drinks as you wanted, within reason of course. And following the game, we decided to head there for a few more before we left. It was a busy night, so especially considering the game was coming to a close, the line was decently long. During the duration of the time I was patiently waiting, I had started to speak with a couple guys right next to me. Shortly into the conversation, one of them spoke up and asked for my phone number. Looking back, I definitely should have said no, but in the state I was in, I gave it to them. After we had finally gotten our drinks, my friends and I decided to call it a night. We parted ways, but instead of calling an Uber and going back to my apartment, I very stupidly decided to text the man I had previously exchanged contact information with. He responded almost right away, saying he'd head over in an Uber and take me back to his place if I wanted. Again, I made a stupid decision and agreed. Eventually he showed up, and we were off back to his place. Though, the drive was a good 45 minutes. When we arrived, I quickly realized we were practically in the middle of nowhere. We weren't anywhere close to the city anymore, and as I looked around, I realized no other property was in sight. Quite honestly, without context, I easily would have mistaken his house for an abandoned building. It was that bad. But regardless, being as intoxicated as I was, I quickly disregarded all my suspicion and followed the man to the front door. As we entered, I quickly realized how clean the place looked from the inside. Like, think hospital level clean, even down to the smell. Without even offering, he quickly poured us a glass of seemingly expensive red wine. I thought nothing of it at the time, and from what I remember, he poured it right in front of me and even drank some himself. Though, that was the last memory I had of that night. The next thing I knew, I was in a bedroom with the sun now clearly shining through the window. The noise of a shower running quickly filled my ears. I was groggy and dazed when I woke up, but I slowly began piecing together where I was, who I was with, and just the overall situation I was in. As it came back to me, I realized I needed to leave immediately. I frantically began to search for my cell phone, clothes, and wallet. But it was no use, I couldn't find them. I rushed out of the bedroom in the hopes to just leave unnoticed prior to this man getting out of the shower. But as I was leaving, my heart sank into my stomach. All of the furniture and floors were completely covered with plastic shower curtains, which I distinctly remember not being there prior to me blacking out the night before. I quickly noticed all of my personal belongings were placed neatly on the kitchen counter, alongside a knife that clearly wasn't a kitchen knife, but rather a hunting knife or something like that. My instincts kicked in, and I instantly grabbed my things and ran out the door. I ran for several minutes in a random direction, panicked and full of adrenaline. A good 10 minutes of full-on running down the road, and I finally stopped to call a friend to pick me up and take me back to my apartment. When I got back, I instantly blocked the guy's number, and to this day have never heard anything from him again. Now, looking back, I realize I should have contacted the authorities immediately, but for whatever reason I never did. It's clear I was not in the right state of mind at that point in my life, and this eats away at me daily, as I believe at this point it's too late for me to report the man, seeing as I don't even have the slightest recollection of where his house was located, or even his name. The detail that haunts me the most is that the only thing missing of my personal belongings was my ID. And this makes me question what the guy's true intentions were. Though, if I'm being honest with myself, I truly believe that man planned on murdering me that morning. The plastic shower curtains all over the apartment and the knife make it clear to me. But I guess I'm just lucky to have never truly found out.